What do you do when everyone assumes you don't belong? 14-year-old Jason Carter is excited for a first-class trip with his successful father, but from the moment they arrive at the airport, he faces judgment and assumptions based on how he looks. As the trip unfolds, Jason is forced to confront not just others' perceptions, but his own sense of identity and worth. Will Jason rise above the unfair treatment and discover where he truly belongs? Watch to find out, and make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories like this. Let us know in the comments, how would you handle being judged unfairly? The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden hue across the sprawling suburbs of Boston as Jason Carter sat on his bed, staring at his packed suitcase. His room was quiet, with only the soft hum of the fan filling the air. He absent-mindedly tapped the armrest of his gaming chair, lost in thought. Today was the day his father had promised for months, a trip. Just the two of them. No work calls, no distractions. Just father and son. Jason glanced at his phone, where a message from his dad, David Carter, sat unopened. "Pick you up at 9 a.m. Be ready," the text read. It was typical of his father. Short, direct, and to the point. Despite the simplicity of the message, Jason felt a small flutter of excitement. His father had been busy for as long as Jason could remember, running one of the country's largest airline companies, which meant he was often away. The trip they were taking wasn't just any trip. It was first class to Los Angeles, a promise of a memorable getaway from their usual fast-paced lives. Jason's mind wandered to memories of the few times he and his father had really connected. Most of those moments were rare. Weekend mornings when David wasn't called into work, or the occasional soccer game when he'd managed to show up. Jason had always understood why his father wasn't around more. David was successful, respected, and carried the weight of the airline's success on his shoulders. But at 14, Jason often wondered what it would be like to have a dad who wasn't always so busy. Grabbing his backpack, Jason stood and looked at himself in the mirror. His jeans and hoodie felt comfortable enough for a long flight. His hair, still a bit messy from sleep, was quickly fixed with a few swipes of his hand. He took a deep breath, willing the nerves away. Today was supposed to be different, special even, but still he couldn't shake a strange sense of unease that had settled in the pit of his stomach. By 8:45 a.m., Jason was waiting in the driveway, his backpack slung over his shoulder, clutching his first-class boarding pass. His dad's black SUV rolled up the street, coming to a smooth stop in front of the house. David stepped out, looking as polished as always in his tailored suit. His phone was already pressed to his ear as he waved at Jason. "Morning, kiddo," David called out, ending his call and sliding his phone into his jacket pocket. "You ready for this?" Jason nodded, managing a smile. "Yeah, I'm ready." David clapped him on the shoulder, then tossed Jason's suitcase into the trunk. "First class all the way to LA. You're gonna love it. Plenty of legroom, gourmet meals. It'll be great." Jason climbed into the passenger seat, still trying to push away the odd feeling that something was off. As they pulled away from the curb and headed toward the airport, Jason stared out the window, watching the world pass by. His dad was talking about work, something about a meeting with investors, new expansion plans, and future business strategies. But Jason found it hard to focus. His mind kept drifting back to the idea of the trip, what it meant, and why it felt so important. This wasn't just about a vacation. It was about reconnecting, about closing the distance that had grown between them over the years. The bustling noise of the airport greeted them as soon as they stepped out of the car. David was on his phone again, making arrangements with an assistant, leaving Jason to lug his backpack toward the terminal. They breezed through check-in, thanks to his dad's VIP status, and soon found themselves standing in front of the first-class lounge. Jason had never flown first class before, but he'd heard about it from his dad, a world of luxury that most people could only dream of. But as they moved through the crowded terminal, Jason began to notice something. People were staring at him. It wasn't the typical glance or casual look that he'd grown accustomed to over the years. These were stares that lingered too long, eyes that seemed to follow him as he walked. Jason shifted uncomfortably under the weight of their gaze, tugging at the hem of his hoodie. David didn't seem to notice. He was busy talking to a colleague on the phone, his voice carrying above the din of the terminal. Jason kept his head down, avoiding eye contact, and tried to focus on navigating through the sea of travelers. As they approached the gate, David finally hung up the phone, turning to Jason with a smile. "You excited?" "First class, kid. This is the good life." Jason forced a smile. "Yeah, it'll be cool." They handed their boarding passes to the gate agent, a woman in her 40s with neatly styled hair and a sharp professional demeanor. She glanced at David's pass, scanned it, and smiled warmly. But when she looked at Jason's, her expression changed. "Sir, are you sure this is your ticket?" the woman asked, her eyes narrowing slightly as she glanced up at Jason. Jason blinked, caught off guard. Yeah, that's mine." The woman hesitated, then scanned the ticket again, her brows furrowed. "One moment, please," she said, her tone polite but distant. Jason felt a prickle of embarrassment as he stepped aside. Other passengers, many of them dressed in business suits or expensive casual wear, were watching him, their eyes flickering with curiosity. Jason fidgeted with his phone, unsure of what to do. His dad was already chatting with someone over the phone again, seemingly unaware of the awkwardness unfolding. Minutes passed, and Jason's discomfort grew. The woman behind the counter was whispering with another gate attendant, a man in his 50s with a stern face. They both glanced at Jason, and he felt the knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. What was going on? Why were they acting like this? The male gate attendant, Tom, strolled over to Jason with a smirk that made Jason's skin crawl. He looked down at Jason as though he were a curiosity, not a customer. "You sure you belong in first class, kid?" Tom's voice was laced with condescension, his eyes narrowing as he scanned Jason's casual outfit. Jason felt heat rush to his face. "Yes, I'm sure," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "My dad booked the tickets for us." Tom exchanged a glance with the woman at the counter. "Well, first class is for a particular kind of traveler," Tom continued, his tone dripping with a smug superiority. "Maybe there's been a mistake. Why don't we get you a seat in coach where you'll be more comfortable?" Jason's heart pounded in his chest. He opened his mouth to argue but found the words stuck in his throat. He felt all the eyes in the terminal on him, judging him, assuming he didn't belong. His phone buzzed in his pocket and Jason quickly pulled it out, hoping it was his father. He texted a quick message. "They won't let me in first class. Something's wrong." The seconds felt like hours as he waited for a reply, his stomach twisting in knots. When his phone finally buzzed again, Jason glanced down at the screen, relief washing over him as he read his father's response. "Stay there. Don't move. I'll handle it." But Jason didn't feel completely reassured. His father's words, though meant to calm him, felt distant. He wasn't sure how his dad would handle it or if he even understood what Jason was going through. Tom was still standing in front of him, waiting for Jason to back down. Jason's grip tightened around his phone, his frustration simmering just below the surface. He wanted to scream, to demand they treat him with the same respect they gave the other passengers. But his throat felt tight, and his voice refused to cooperate. Just when Jason thought the situation couldn't get worse, the phone behind the counter rang. Melissa, the female gate attendant, picked it up, her expression stiff and professional. "Gate 4, she said, her voice clipped. As she listened, her face slowly drained of color. Her eyes darted to Jason, and her hand trembled slightly as she set the phone back down. I understand, sir," she stammered, glancing at Tom with wide eyes. "Yes, right away." Melissa turned to Tom, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's the boss's son," she said, her words rushed and frantic. "His father owns the airline." The color drained from Tom's face. He blinked, his earlier arrogance crumbling in an instant. He looked back at Jason, his expression filled with shock and regret. Tom's entire demeanor changed in the blink of an eye. The smug superiority disappeared, replaced by a forced smile. "Terribly sorry about that, young man," he said, his voice sickly sweet now. "There's been a misunderstanding. We'll get you seated in first class right away." Jason's head was spinning. Just moments ago, they had treated him like an outsider, someone who didn't belong. And now, because of who his father was, they were bending over backward to accommodate him. It didn't feel right. None of them felt right. He followed Tom silently as he was escorted to the first-class cabin, his emotions a tangled mess of anger, confusion, and humiliation. The plush leather seat felt cold against his skin as he sat down, the flight attendants hurrying around him with forced smiles and overly polite offers of drinks and snacks. But Jason wasn't hungry. He wasn't thirsty. He was angry. Angry that they hadn't seen him for who he was, just a kid trying to travel with his father. Instead, they judged him, dismissed him, until they realized who his father was. Jason stared out the window as the plane began to taxi down the runway, the city shrinking into a patchwork of lights and roads below. His phone buzzed in his hand, another message from his father. "Are you okay?" Jason stared at the words, unsure of how to respond. He typed a simple reply, "Yes," but he knew deep down it wasn't the truth. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane soared through the sky, but for Jason, the sound was distant, almost muted. He stared out of the window, watching the clouds pass by below. The city was long gone, replaced by an endless stretch of blue sky, but his thoughts were still trapped back at the gate. The way Melissa and Tom had treated him before realizing who his father was kept replaying in his mind. Jason shifted in his seat, the luxurious leather feeling too stiff, too cold, as if it didn't belong to him. The flight attendants were moving up and down the aisle, offering first-class passengers a variety of drinks and gourmet snacks. Their smiles were bright, but Jason couldn't help noticing how they glanced at him when they thought he wasn't looking. The judgment, the assumptions all lingered in their eyes, even behind those polished smiles. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" a flight attendant asked, her tone cheerful but forced, like she was compensating for the earlier awkwardness. Jason looked up, offering a small, uncomfortable smile. Just water, thanks." As she handed him the water, Jason caught a glimpse of the other passengers around him. Most of them were older, dressed in expensive suits or casual clothes that screamed designer brands. They all seemed perfectly at ease, chatting quietly or reading newspapers. They belonged here, Jason realized. Not just because they had first-class tickets, but because they carried themselves like they were used to this, like the world had always treated them this way. Jason shifted again, feeling the weight of the experience settle heavily in his chest. He'd flown many times before, but never first class. And now, despite sitting in one of the most luxurious seats on the plane, he felt more out of place than ever. His clothes, just jeans and a hoodie, felt wrong, like they didn't match the image of the other passengers. He couldn't help but wonder if that was why they had judged him in the first place. Did clothes make the man, or did something deeper define whether someone was worthy of respect? Jason's phone buzzed softly in his hand. He glanced down to see another text from his father. "We'll talk when we land. I'll meet you at the gate." Jason stared at the message for a long time, his thoughts swirling. He wasn't sure if his father would truly understand what had happened, if he even could. His father had lived his whole life in a world where people respected him because of his success, his power, and his wealth. But Jason wasn't sure that world was his to claim. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Jason leaned his head back against the seat, closing his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind was too busy, too loud with the conflicting emotions tearing through him. On the one hand, he knew the flight was supposed to be a fun, bonding experience, a special treat his father had promised for so long. On the other hand, that moment at the gate had soured everything. It wasn't just that they had judged him. It was the way everything changed the moment they realized his father was powerful. It was as though their perception of him had flipped, not because of anything he'd done, but because of who his father was. And that thought, it gnawed at him. Jason's father always talked about earning respect, about working hard to be successful. But in that moment at the gate, Jason had done nothing but exist. He hadn't earned anything. They hadn't even bothered to give him the chance. It felt like everything had been reduced to wealth and status, like the value of a person wasn't in their character, but in the amount of power they could wield. A part of him wanted to tell his father how it had felt, how much it hurt to be looked down on like that. But another part of him wasn't sure if his dad would understand. His father had spent his entire life in a world where doors opened for him simply because of his name. Could someone like that truly understand what it felt like to be judged before you even had the chance to prove yourself? Jason's stomach twisted with frustration. He opened his eyes and reached for his phone, scrolling through his messages. A few of his friends had texted him, asking what the first-class experience was like, and he debated telling them the truth. Instead, he typed out a vague response. "It's fine. Pretty fancy, I guess." He hit send, not wanting to get into the details of what had really happened. As he put his phone away, he realized that this trip, which was supposed to be special, was turning into something else entirely. It wasn't just about flying first class or spending time with his dad anymore. It was about something deeper, about how people saw him and about how he saw himself in a world that seemed to judge based on appearances and assumptions. The plane touched down smoothly in Los Angeles, and Jason felt a knot of tension release from his chest. The familiar feeling of landing after a long flight was usually a relief, but today it felt different. The weight of what had happened back at the gate was still there, heavy in his mind. As the plane taxied to the gate, Jason gathered his things slowly, waiting for the first-class cabin to clear out. The other passengers were already on their feet, grabbing their designer luggage from the overhead bins and chatting casually about their plans in LA. Jason stayed seated, feeling the pressure to hurry, but also wanting to avoid the stares that he knew were coming. When the aisle finally cleared, Jason stood up and slung his backpack over his shoulder. He stepped off the plane, walking down the jet bridge with a mix of relief and anxiety. He had no idea what he was going to say to his father. Maybe it wasn't worth bringing up. Maybe it was better to just let it go and enjoy the trip. But as soon as he saw his father waiting at the gate, looking down at his phone, the frustration bubbled up again. David looked up and smiled when he saw Jason, waving him over. "There you are. How was the flight?" Jason shrugged. "It was fine." David's smile faded slightly, sensing something off. "What happened? You don't seem like yourself." Jason hesitated, his mind racing. Should he tell him? Would it even make a difference? "They didn't want to let me in first class," Jason finally said, his voice quiet but firm. "They didn't think I belonged until they found out who you were." David frowned, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Jason shifted uncomfortably, his hands tightening on the straps of his backpack. "The gate attendants, they thought I had the wrong ticket. They didn't want to let me on the plane until they realized you own the airline." David's face tightened, his jaw clenching. "I'm sorry, Jason. I didn't expect that to happen. I thought things would be different." Jason shook his head. "It's not your fault. It's just, I don't know. It's the way people are, I guess." They stood in silence for a moment, the noise of the busy terminal fading into the background. Jason looked at his father, searching for something, some acknowledgement of what he had felt. David sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'll talk to them. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Jason nodded, but the words didn't bring him the comfort he'd hoped for. His dad meant well, but he still didn't get it. It wasn't just about fixing the situation or making sure it didn't happen again. It was about how it felt in that moment. Like no matter what he did, no matter how hard he tried, there would always be people who saw him less. Later that evening, after they'd settled into their hotel, Jason and his father sat in the lounge, waiting for room service. The tension from earlier had faded slightly, but it still lingered in the air between them. David glanced over at Jason, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You know," he said quietly, "when I was starting out, people didn't take me seriously either." Jason looked up, surprised. His father rarely talked about his early days, about what it was like before he became a successful CEO. Jason had always assumed his dad's rise to the top had been smooth, almost inevitable. David chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Back when I was first getting into the airline business, I was young, and I didn't have a lot of connections. People looked at me like I didn't belong, like I was just some kid with big ideas and no way to back them up." Jason frowned, trying to imagine his father as anything other than the confident, successful man he'd always known. "Really?" David nodded. "Yeah. It took a long time for people to take me seriously. I had to prove myself over and over again. And even then, there were still people who judged me based on things that had nothing to do with who I was or what I could do." Jason leaned back in his chair, processing his father's words. It wasn't exactly the same as what he had gone through, but it helped, knowing that his dad had faced his own struggles, his own moments of doubt. "But you made it," Jason said quietly. "You proved them wrong. David smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. Yeah, I did. But it wasn't easy. And I know it's not easy for you either. People are always going to make assumptions, Jason. They're always going to judge you before they know you. But that doesn't mean you have to let them define you. Jason nodded, his father's words sinking in. Maybe it wasn't about avoiding the judgment or trying to change people's minds. Maybe it was about knowing who you were, no matter what anyone else thought. The room service arrived, interrupting the conversation, and they spent the rest of the evening eating and talking about lighter things, places they wanted to visit in LA, the food they were excited to try. The tension from earlier wasn't completely gone, but it felt lighter now, less oppressive. For the first time in a long time, Jason felt like he and his father were truly connecting. The next morning, Jason and his father planned to spend the day exploring Los Angeles, checking out the beaches, grabbing lunch at a popular restaurant, and maybe even taking a tour of the city. Jason was still processing their conversation from the night before, but for the first time in a while, he felt a small sense of calm. Maybe this trip really would be the start of something new for him and his father. They stepped out of the hotel elevator, heading toward the front lobby to meet their driver. The lobby was busy, filled with tourists and business travelers, and Jason caught a few glances from people who seemed to size him up the moment they saw him. He had grown accustomed to it by now, the way people looked at him like they were trying to figure out if he fit in. The unease was still there, but Jason tried to push it aside. As they reached the front desk to check on their ride, a bellboy approached them, his expression shifting as he glanced at Jason. "Excuse me," the bellboy said, his tone polite but distant. "Are you lost? The hotel staff entrance is through the side door." Jason froze, the words hanging in the air. He blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. The hotel staff entrance? His mind raced, confusion quickly giving way to frustration. Did this guy just assume he didn't belong here because of the way he looked? Because he was dressed casually? The familiar knot of anger started to tighten in his chest again. David, who had been talking to the concierge, turned around just in time to see the exchange. His face tightened, and he stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "No, we're guests here," David said, his eyes narrowing at the bellboy. "We're not lost." The bellboy's eyes widened in realization, and his face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't mean—" David cut him off. "I'm sure you didn't." His voice was low, but Jason could hear the frustration simmering underneath. He turned back to Jason, his expression softening. "Come on, let's go." They walked away from the bellboy without another word, but Jason's mind was spinning. It was happening again. Another person making assumptions about him without knowing anything about him. Jason clenched his fists, trying to steady his breathing. He could feel the heat rising in his face, the anger simmering just below the surface. As they stepped outside into the warm California air, Jason couldn't hold it in any longer. "Why does this keep happening?" he burst out, his voice tight with frustration. "Why do people keep treating me like I don't belong?" David stopped walking, turning to face Jason. He looked at his son, his expression unreadable for a moment, then sighed. "People make assumptions, Jason," he said quietly. "It's not right, but it happens." "But why?" Jason asked, his voice cracking with anger. "Why do they look at me and think I'm not supposed to be here? I didn't do anything wrong." David ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling with how to respond. "I wish I had an easy answer for you," he said after a moment. "I wish I could tell you it'll get better. But the truth is, some people they judge others based on things that have nothing to do with who they really are." Jason bit his lip, trying to hold back the tears of frustration that threatened to spill over. "It's not fair," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "No, it's not," David agreed, his voice soft. "But that doesn't mean you let them win. You keep being yourself no matter what they think. You belong wherever you choose to be, Jason. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Jason looked up at his father, his heart heavy with the weight of his emotions. He wanted to believe his father's words, wanted to feel like he truly belonged. But right now, all he could feel was the sting of being judged over and over again, no matter where he went or what he did. They stood there in silence for a moment, the noise of the city bustling around them. Jason took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside him. He didn't know how to make the anger go away, but maybe, just maybe, His father was right. Maybe the only thing he could control was how he reacted, how he refused to let other people's assumptions define him. That evening, after a long day of sightseeing, Jason and his father returned to the hotel. Jason was still feeling the weight of the morning's encounter, but he tried to push it aside, focusing instead on enjoying the time with his dad. They had dinner at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the city, and for a little while, Jason managed to forget about the frustrations of the day. But when they returned to their room, Jason's father had another call to take, another work emergency that couldn't wait. Jason didn't mind. He was used to it now. But just as he was about to settle in for the night, there was a knock at the door. Jason opened it to find his Aunt Linda standing there, her face lighting up with a warm smile. "Hey, kiddo," she said, pulling him into a quick hug. "Your dad told me you guys were in town, so I thought I'd stop by and say hi." Aunt Linda was David's older sister, and she lived nearby in LA. Jason had always liked her. She was the kind of person who could make anyone feel at ease, and she always seemed to know when something was bothering him. "Come on in," Jason said, stepping aside to let her in. "Dad's on a call, but he should be done soon." Linda nodded, glancing around the room before turning back to Jason. "So, how's the trip going? You guys having a good time?" Jason shrugged, not sure how to answer. "It's been okay," he said, trying to keep his voice neutral. Linda raised an eyebrow, clearly sensing that something was off. She sat down on the edge of the bed, patting the spot next to her. "Come on, kiddo. What's going on? You know you can talk to me." Jason hesitated for a moment, then sat down next to her. The frustration and anger he'd been holding in all day started to bubble to the surface again. "It's just, everywhere we go, people keep looking at me like I don't belong," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "At the airport, at the hotel, even just walking around, they keep judging me, like they're waiting for me to mess up or something." Linda listened quietly, her expression softening as Jason spoke. When he finished, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm so sorry you're going through that, Jason," she said gently. "It's not fair, and it's not right. But you know what? It's their problem, not yours." Jason looked down at the floor, his chest heavy with the weight of his emotions. "But it still feels like it's my problem," he muttered. "It's like no matter what I do, people are always going to see me the wrong way." Linda squeezed his shoulder. "I know it feels that way sometimes," she said, "and I'm not going to lie to you. There will always be people who make assumptions, who judge you before they even know you. But that doesn't mean you have to accept their judgment. You are so much more than what other people think of you, Jason." Jason glanced up at her, his frustration still simmering but beginning to cool. "But how do I make it stop? How do I make them see me for who I really am?" "You can't always control how other people see you," Linda said softly, "but you can control how you see yourself. Don't let their judgment make you doubt your own worth. You belong here just as much as anyone else. And the people who really matter, they'll see you for who you are." Jason nodded, her words sinking in. He knew she was right, but it was still hard to accept. It was hard to let go of the anger he felt every time someone judged him without knowing him. But maybe, just maybe, he could start by focusing on how he saw himself, on not letting their assumptions define him. Linda smiled at him, her eyes warm with understanding. "You're a strong kid, Jason. Don't forget that." Jason managed a small smile in return. "Thanks, Aunt Linda." The following day, Jason and his father were invited to a formal event hosted by one of David's business associates. It was a fancy affair, held in a large ballroom at an upscale hotel, and Jason felt out of place the moment they walked through the doors. The men wore expensive suits, the women donned designer dresses, and the air was filled with the quiet hum of polite conversation. Jason tugged at the collar of his button-down shirt, feeling uncomfortable in the formal clothes his dad had insisted he wear. He stuck close to his father, trying to blend in, but he couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was watching him, judging him. His earlier conversation with Aunt Linda had helped, but the nagging sense of not belonging was still there, lurking beneath the surface. As they mingled with the other guests, Jason overheard snippets of conversations, talk of investments, luxury vacations, and high-end real estate. He felt more out of place with every passing minute. At one point, as Jason stood by the refreshment table, a man in his 50s approached. He was dressed in an immaculate suit, his hair slicked back with precision. He glanced at Jason, his eyes sweeping over him with a subtle, dismissive judgment. "You must be David's son," the man said, his voice polite but cold. "I didn't realize he had a kid so young." Jason nodded, feeling the man's gaze linger on him like an unwanted spotlight. "Yeah, I'm Jason." The man's lips curled into a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I see. Well, enjoy the party," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But be careful. This isn't really a place for kids. You might find yourself out of your depth." Jason's stomach tightened, the knot of anger from the past few days returning in full force. He clenched his fists at his sides, biting back the urge to snap at the man. But before he could say anything, his father appeared at his side. David's expression was calm, but Jason could see the tension in his posture. "Is there a problem here?" David asked, his voice quiet but firm. The man smiled again, this time more genuinely. "No problem at all," he said, raising his glass in a mock toast. "Just offering some advice." David's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he placed a hand on Jason's shoulder and steered him away from the man, toward a quieter corner of the room. "Ignore him," David muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "He doesn't know what he's talking about." But Jason couldn't ignore it. The man's words echoed in his head, feeding into all the doubts and frustrations he'd been feeling for the past few days. He felt like he was drowning in it, this constant pressure to prove himself, to belong in a world that seemed determined to keep him out. Jason stopped walking, turning to face his father. "Why do people keep treating me like I don't belong?" he asked, his voice tight with emotion. "I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't ask to be judged everywhere I go." David looked at his son, his expression softening with sympathy. "I know, Jason," he said quietly, "and I wish I could make it stop. But the world, it's not always fair." Jason shook his head, his chest tight with frustration. "It's not fair at all." David sighed, placing a hand on Jason's shoulder. "You don't have to prove anything to them, Jason. You belong here, just as much as anyone else. Don't let them make you feel otherwise." Jason nodded, his father's words sinking in. But even as he tried to let the anger go, he couldn't help but feel the weight of it still pressing down on him. It was exhausting, constantly fighting to be seen for who he really was, instead of what people assumed about him. As the evening wore on, Jason and his father stayed at the event, mingling with the other guests and trying to enjoy themselves. But the encounter with the man at the refreshment table lingered in Jason's mind, a constant reminder of the struggle he faced. David could see it too. He watched his son throughout the night, noticing the way Jason's shoulders tensed whenever someone glanced his way, the way he hesitated to speak when introduced to new people. David had always prided himself on being able to handle difficult situations, to navigate the complexities of his business with ease. But this was different. This was his son, his quiet, thoughtful son, who was clearly hurting. It wasn't until they were on their way back to the hotel that David finally spoke up. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," he began, his voice soft in the quiet of the car, "about how people keep judging you. I've been so focused on my own work, on my own life, that I didn't realize how hard this has been for you." Jason glanced over at his father, surprised by the admission. David rarely talked about feelings, especially not his own. "I've always believed that if you worked hard enough, if you proved yourself, people would respect you," David continued. "But I see now that it's not always that simple. People can be unfair, and sometimes, no matter what you do, they'll still judge you based on things that have nothing to do with who you are." Jason nodded, his father's words hitting close to home. "Yeah," he said quietly, "that's what it feels like." David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry, Jason. I didn't realize how much this was affecting you. I thought if I could just give you everything I never had, you'd have an easier time. But I see now that it's not about money or power. It's about something deeper." Jason was quiet for a moment, his father's words sinking in. He had always admired his dad, respected him for everything he had accomplished, but hearing him admit that he didn't have all the answers, that he was still figuring things out, made Jason feel closer to him than he had in a long time. "I don't need everything handed to me," Jason said quietly. "I just want to be treated like I belong." David nodded, his expression serious. "And you do belong, Jason. I know it's hard, but you have to keep believing that. No one can take that away from you." For the first time in days, Jason felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe his father didn't have all the answers, but he was trying, and that was enough for now. The following morning, the sun shone brightly over the Los Angeles skyline as Jason sat on the balcony of their hotel room, staring out at the city below. It was still early, and the streets were just beginning to come alive with the hustle and bustle of a new day. The tension of the previous night had lessened, but Jason still felt its weight lingering in his chest. His conversation with his father had helped, but it hadn't erased the frustration that had been building inside him over the past few days. He kept thinking about that man at the event, how casually he'd dismissed Jason, as though he didn't belong. And no matter how many times his father told him that he did belong, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that there would always be people who saw him as less. People who judged him based on his appearance, his age, or some other superficial factor. But as he sat there, listening to the sounds of the city, Jason thought about what his Aunt Linda had said. He couldn't control how other people saw him. He couldn't change their assumptions or make them see him for who he really was. But he could control how he saw himself. He could refuse to let their judgment define him. Jason pulled out his phone, scrolling through the messages from his friends back home. They were all excited to hear about his trip, asking him what first class was like, what Los Angeles was like. For a moment, Jason considered telling them everything: the awkward stares, the assumptions, the way people had treated him as though he didn't belong. But then he realized something. The trip wasn't just about those moments of discomfort. There had been good moments too. Moments where he had bonded with his father, where they had finally connected after so much distance. And maybe that was what he needed to focus on. Maybe that was where his strength came from, not from proving himself to strangers, but from knowing that the people who mattered saw him for who he really was. Jason typed a quick message to his friends. "It's been a good trip. LA is amazing, and the first class was crazy fancy. But the best part has been spending time with my dad." He hit send, feeling a small sense of relief. For the first time in a while, he felt like he was starting to take control of the narrative, starting to shape the story of his life, instead of letting other people's assumptions shape it for him. Later that afternoon, Jason and his father headed to another event. This one was a business lunch at a high-end restaurant downtown. David had been invited by another business associate, and though Jason wasn't particularly excited about spending another day surrounded by wealthy strangers, he agreed to go, hoping that this time would be different. The restaurant was sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning view of the city. Jason and his father were seated at a long table with several other guests, all of them dressed in expensive suits and dresses. Jason felt the familiar knot of unease in his stomach as he looked around, but he reminded himself of what his father and Aunt Linda had said. He belonged here, whether other people believed it or not. As the meal progressed, Jason tried to relax, focusing on the food and the conversation around him. But as the guests began to chat more freely, the topic of conversation shifted to wealth and status. One of the men at the table, a tall, silver-haired businessman named Richard, leaned back in his chair and smirked as he sipped his wine. "You know," Richard said, his voice dripping with condescension, "it's funny how people think they can just walk into these places and act like they belong, just because they can afford a ticket or a reservation. There's more to it than that, you know? It's about class, about knowing how to carry yourself." Jason stiffened, his eyes narrowing as he listened to Richard's words. He wasn't addressing Jason directly, but the insinuation was clear. Richard glanced around the table, his gaze lingering on Jason for just a moment too long. Jason's heart pounded in his chest, the familiar anger rising inside him. He had heard enough of these subtle digs, these veiled insults that questioned his right to be in these spaces. But this time, he wasn't going to stay quiet. This time, he was going to stand up for himself. "Maybe it's not about class," Jason said, his voice steady but firm. "Maybe it's about how you treat people. You know, like judging someone before you even know them. The table fell silent, all eyes turning to Jason. Richard raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised that Jason had spoken up. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You've got a lot to learn, kid," he said, his tone dismissive. "This world isn't for everyone." Jason's hands clenched into fists under the table, but he didn't back down. "Maybe you're the one who has a lot to learn," he said, his voice growing stronger. "Because the world isn't just for people like you. It's for everyone." Richard's smirk faded, and for a moment, Jason thought he might argue. But before he could say anything else, David spoke up, his voice calm but authoritative. "Jason's right," David said, glancing at Richard with a stern expression. "It's not about class or money, it's about how you treat people. And if you don't understand that, maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here." Jason felt a surge of pride as his father stood up for him, backing him up in front of the entire table. Richard's face turned red, and he muttered something under his breath, but he didn't argue any further. The tension at the table slowly dissolved, and the conversation shifted to safer topics. As the lunch continued, Jason felt a sense of accomplishment he hadn't felt in a long time. He had stood up for himself. For the first time, he hadn't let someone else's judgment define him. And his father had supported him, reinforcing the lesson that had taken Jason so long to learn. He belonged, not because of his father's success or his first-class ticket, but because he was Jason. Nothing more, nothing less. After the lunch ended, Jason and his father walked back to the car in silence. The weight of what had happened at the table still hung in the air, but this time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like something had shifted, something important. As they drove back to the hotel, David glanced over at Jason, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I'm proud of you, you know," he said quietly. Jason looked up, surprised. "For what?" "For standing up for yourself," David said, his voice warm. "I've been watching you these past few days, and I know it hasn't been easy. But today, you didn't let him get to you. You didn't let his judgment define you." Jason smiled, feeling a sense of pride well up inside him. I didn't want to keep quiet anymore," he admitted. "I was tired of letting people think they could treat me like I don't belong." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've spent my whole life fighting to belong in this world, Jason. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I built a name for myself, people would respect me. But now I see that it's not just about proving yourself to other people. It's about knowing that you belong, even when they don't see it." Jason was quiet for a moment, letting his father's words sink in. He had always admired his dad's success, but now he saw that his father's journey had been more difficult than he realized. David had fought his own battles, faced his own doubts and judgments, and now Jason was beginning to understand that their struggles, while different, were connected. "You've taught me a lot, Dad," Jason said quietly, "but I think the most important thing you've taught me is that I don't have to prove anything to anyone. I just have to be myself." David smiled, reaching over to ruffle Jason's hair. "You're a smart kid," he said affectionately. "Smarter than I was at your age, that's for sure." Jason laughed, feeling a lightness in his chest that he hadn't felt in days. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace with who he was. He didn't have to keep fighting for other people's approval because he knew deep down that he belonged, no matter where he was or what anyone else thought. That evening, as the sun set over the city, Jason and his father stood on the balcony of their hotel room, watching the lights of Los Angeles twinkle below. The air was cool and refreshing, and Jason felt a sense of calm settling over him. His father had been quiet for most of the evening, but now as they stood together, David finally spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about what we've been through on this trip," he said softly, "about the way people have treated you. And I realize now that I haven't always been there for you the way I should have been." Jason looked up at his father, surprised by the admission. "What do you mean?" David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've spent so much time focused on my work, on building my business, that I didn't see how hard it's been for you. I thought if I gave you everything you needed, money, security, opportunities, that it would be enough. But I see now that it's not just about that. It's about being there for you, emotionally. It's about helping you navigate this world that's not always kind." Jason felt a lump form in his throat, but he managed to keep his voice steady. "You've done your best, Dad," he said quietly, "and I appreciate everything you've done for me. But yeah, it's been hard sometimes." David nodded, his eyes filled with regret. "I want to do better, Jason. I want to be there for you more. I know I can't protect you from everything, but I can at least be someone you can talk to, someone who understands." Jason smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "Thanks, Dad. That means a lot." They stood in silence for a while, watching the city below. Jason's mind was calm, his thoughts no longer racing with frustration or anger. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he understood himself and his father a little better. As the night deepened, Jason realized something important. The world wasn't always fair, and there would always be people who judged him, who saw him as something less. But he didn't have to accept their judgment. He didn't have to prove anything to anyone but himself. He belonged not because of his father's success, not because of the first-class ticket, but because he was Jason. And that, he knew, was enough. 2 weeks had passed since the trip to Los Angeles, and Jason was back home in Boston, sitting at the breakfast table with his dad. The familiar sounds of their house, the soft ticking of the kitchen clock, the hum of the refrigerator, felt comforting after the whirlwind of emotions and experiences they had gone through in California. Jason had been reflecting on everything that had happened, the encounters with people who judged him, the emotional moments he'd shared with his father, and, most importantly, the lessons he had learned about himself. As he sat there sipping his orange juice, he realized that something had changed inside him. The knot of frustration and insecurity that had weighed him down for so long was finally beginning to loosen. He felt lighter, more grounded in who he was. The trip hadn't been easy, but it had shown him something important, that he could navigate the world on his own terms, without letting other people's judgments define him. David, who was reading the morning newspaper, glanced up at Jason. "You've been quiet since we got back," he said, folding the paper and setting it aside. "How are you feeling?" Jason thought about the question for a moment before answering. "I'm good," he said honestly. "Better than I was before." David raised an eyebrow, his expression curious. "Yeah? How so?" Jason set down his glass and leaned back in his chair. "I don't know. I just feel like I'm not as worried about what other people think anymore. I mean, it still bothers me when people judge me, but it doesn't feel as heavy. I know who I am now, and I know I belong, no matter what they think." David smiled, a look of pride flashing in his eyes. "That's a big realization," he said. "It takes some people their whole lives to figure that out." Jason shrugged, feeling a small sense of accomplishment. "I guess I just got tired of letting other people decide how I should feel about myself." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's exactly right. You've got to live your life for yourself, not for anyone else." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the morning light streaming in through the kitchen window. Jason felt a deep sense of peace, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't that the world had changed, it was that he had changed, and that made all the difference. "So," David said after a moment, his tone lightening, "are you ready for school tomorrow?" Jason grinned, rolling his eyes. "Not even close. Summer went by way too fast." David chuckled, shaking his head. "That's how it always feels. But hey, at least you've got some good stories to tell your friends about the trip." Jason's smile faltered slightly as he thought back to the moments of discrimination and judgment he'd faced during the trip. He wasn't sure if he wanted to relive those experiences by talking about them with his friends. But then again, maybe sharing what he'd learned would help them understand him better. "I might tell them some of it," Jason said thoughtfully, "but I think I'll focus on the good parts, like the time we spent together." David looked at him, a warmth in his eyes that Jason hadn't seen often before. "I'm glad to hear that," he said quietly, "because that was the best part for me too." The next day, Jason stood in front of his high school, watching as students hurried inside to start the new school year. The familiar buzz of chatter and laughter filled the air, and Jason felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. It was always strange coming back after summer break, but this time, things felt different. He had changed. The way he saw the world and the way he saw himself wasn't the same as it had been before the trip to Los Angeles. And as he looked around at his classmates, he realized that he was seeing them differently too. Jason made his way through the hallways, weaving through the crowds of students as he headed to his locker. He passed by a few kids he recognized last year, some of whom had been part of the popular crowd. The ones who always seemed so sure of themselves, so confident in their place at school. Jason had spent a lot of time wondering if he'd ever feel as comfortable in his own skin as they seemed to be in theirs. But now he realized that it didn't matter. He didn't need to compare himself to them anymore. He didn't need their approval because he had already found his own sense of belonging. He was Jason Carter, and that was enough. At his locker, Jason was greeted by a couple of his friends, Logan and Emma, who were chatting excitedly about their summers. When they saw Jason, they waved him over. "Dude, how was LA?" Logan asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Did you get to meet any celebrities?" Jason laughed, shaking his head. "No celebrities, but it was still pretty cool. I got to fly first class for the first time." Emma raised an eyebrow, impressed. "First class? Fancy. How was that?" Jason hesitated for a moment, the memories of the trip flashing through his mind. He thought about the uncomfortable stares, the assumptions people had made about him. But then he remembered the conversations he'd had with his dad, the lessons he had learned about standing up for himself and finding his own sense of worth. "It was interesting," Jason said, choosing his words carefully. "There were some moments that were kind of tough, but I learned a lot about myself." Logan and Emma exchanged confused glances. "Tough? What do you mean?" Logan asked. Jason thought for a moment, then decided to be honest. "There were a few times when people didn't think I belonged in first class. They made assumptions about me because of how I looked, or because I didn't seem like I fit in with the other passengers. It wasn't easy to deal with, but in the end I realized that it doesn't really matter what they think. What matters is how I see myself." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "That's a good lesson to learn. People can be so judgmental, especially when they don't know the whole story." Jason smiled, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. It felt good to talk about it, to share his experience with his friends without letting it weigh him down. He had faced those challenges, and he had come out stronger because of them. As they walked to their first class of the day, Jason felt a new sense of confidence. He wasn't worried about fitting in or being judged anymore. He knew who he was, and that was enough. When they reached the classroom, Jason took a seat at his desk, pulling out his notebook and pens. The teacher began to call roll, and Jason glanced out the window, watching as the sunlight streamed in through the glass. For the first time in a long time, he felt completely at ease. Jason's journey of self-discovery had been challenging, but it had also been transformative. He had faced moments of judgment, moments where people had tried to make him feel like he didn't belong. But through those experiences, he had learned that his worth wasn't defined by other people's opinions. It was defined by him. The trip to Los Angeles had been a turning point in Jason's life. It had shown him that the world wasn't always fair, and that there would always be people who made assumptions based on appearances or status. But it had also shown him that he had the power to rise above those judgments, to stand tall and be proud of who he was, no matter what anyone else thought. As he sat in his classroom, ready to face the challenges of a new school year, Jason knew that there would still be difficult moments ahead. There would still be people who judged him unfairly, but now he was ready for it. He was stronger, more confident, and more sure of himself than ever before. The world might not have changed, but Jason had, and that, he realized, was enough. If you enjoyed Jason's journey of self-discovery and the lessons he learned about belonging, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We've got more powerful stories coming your way, exploring themes of identity, resilience, and overcoming life's challenges. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on our next story, and share this video with friends who might need a reminder that their worth comes from within. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more inspiring content.
When 13-year-old Evan Miller went down to the river that quiet afternoon, he thought it would be just another day, a chance to escape the worries of home, to fish, and to find a moment of peace. But what he saw from the riverbank would set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. A man, battered and lifeless, thrown from a bridge by shadowy figures, a split-second decision to dive into the cold, rushing water. What Evan didn't know then was that this act of bravery would unravel a dangerous truth, one that powerful people would do anything to keep hidden. With his mother Rebecca and a man named Henry Parker, who carries secrets as heavy as the river that nearly claimed him, Evan is drawn into a conflict far bigger than himself. Mason Hayes, a ruthless businessman with everything to lose, has men watching from the shadows, cars parked on empty streets, and plans that leave no room for loose ends. As the danger escalates, Evan and Henry must rely on their courage and each other to expose the truth. But how much will they risk to make sure justice prevails? And will doing the right thing be enough to keep them safe? The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, its golden rays slipping through the branches of towering oaks and casting dappled shadows on the riverbank. The water, slow and reflective, mirrored the surrounding world like a glassy window. It was quiet here, save for the occasional buzz of a dragonfly or the soft gurgle of the river passing over stones. 14-year-old Evan Miller sat cross-legged near the bank, a simple fishing rod propped against a rock. His calloused hands worked a fishing line, fingers threading a hook with practiced ease. Evan was small for his age, with sandy blonde hair that always fell over his forehead and a pair of deep-set brown eyes that seemed to absorb everything around him. He wore worn-out jeans with holes in the knees and a shirt 2 sizes too big a hand-me-down from a cousin he barely saw anymore. This spot, tucked under the rusty old bridge, was Evan's escape. For hours, he could forget about the empty fridge back home, the pile of unpaid bills his mother tried to hide in the drawer, or the muffled arguments from their landlord demanding rent. Out here, Evan could pretend the world was simple: a fishing rod, a quiet river, and maybe a lucky catch to bring home for dinner. Evan's father, William, had taught him to fish before he passed away. It had been 3 years since the accident, a hit and run on his way home from a late shift. The loss had crushed Evan's mother, Rebecca. She had been left with little but William's old tools, a few memories, and the task of raising a son on her own. "Focus, Evan," Evan whispered to himself, snapping out of his thoughts. He adjusted his grip on the rod and waited, watching the water ripple gently. Rebecca Miller stood behind the counter at Jody's diner, wiping down menus with a tired hand. The diner was a relic of the past, faded booths with vinyl seats, chipped coffee mugs, and the lingering smell of grease and syrup. It was the only job Rebecca could find after William's death, and though the pay was small and the hours long, she clung to it. Rebecca loved her son fiercely. She saw so much of William in Evan, his quiet patience, his stubborn streak, and the way his eyes lit up when he smiled. But Rebecca also saw the strain on Evan's face, the weight he carried for someone so young. She knew he spent hours at the river fishing, not just for sport, but because some nights, that was how they ate. "I'll work another shift," she had promised herself the night before, counting loose change to buy milk. But deep down, Rebecca worried. No matter how hard she worked, it never seemed enough to keep the lights on and food on the table. Evan's rod tugged sharply, snapping his focus back to the river. He gripped it tightly, his heart jumping as he reeled in the line. For a moment, he thought it might be a big catch, a fish heavy enough to make his mother smile. But as he pulled harder, the rod bent in a strange way, the line dragging oddly through the water. And then, from above, he heard it. A car door slamming. Evan froze, his gaze drifting to the bridge. The old steel bridge stretched across the river just a short distance upstream. It was rarely used anymore, except by travelers who took the back road into town. Evan peered through the leaves, his chest tightening as he watched a black car parked in the middle of the bridge. The afternoon sunlight glared off its polished surface, making it hard to see. "What is going on?" Evan whispered to himself, ducking lower in the bushes. He squinted, watching a man step out of the driver's side. The figure moved with stiff, deliberate motions, his shoulders tense. Evan could not make out his face from this distance, but there was something unsettling about the way the man turned toward the railing. And then Evan saw it a second figure, smaller, struggling weakly as the man grabbed him by the arms. Evan's breath hitched in his throat. He wanted to yell, to call for help, but his voice caught. He could only watch in horror as the man leaned over the railing and with a final shove, let go. There was a loud splash, echoing across the river like a gunshot. The man stood at the railing for a moment, staring down into the water. Then, without looking back, he climbed into the car. Tires squealed as the black sedan sped off, leaving nothing but dust and silence. Evan's mind raced. Someone was in the water. For a moment, fear paralyzed him. His first instinct was to run, to sprint back home, and pretend he had not seen anything at all. But his father's voice echoed in his mind, soft and steady, as it had been all those years ago. Do the right thing, Ev, even when it is hard. Swallowing his fear, Evan dropped his fishing rod and kicked off his shoes. Without another thought, he sprinted along the riverbank, his feet slapping against the damp earth. He reached the edge of the water just as the figure drifted into view. It was a man, an older man, his face pale and slack, his silver hair plastered to his forehead. He was not moving. Evan's heart pounded wildly in his chest. He did not know if the man was alive, but there was no time to think. "Come on, Evan," he muttered to himself, willing his legs to move. The river's edge was cold and muddy as he waded in. The water pulled at his legs, the current far stronger than it looked. Evan gasped at the shock of it, but pressed on, swimming toward the lifeless figure. The man was farther than he thought, and each stroke burned in Evan's arms. "Please don't let me mess this up," he whispered through chattering teeth. Finally, Evan reached him. Grabbing the man under the arms, he tilted his head above the water, gasping for breath. The man was heavier than he looked, his clothes waterlogged and dragging them both under. Evan's muscles screamed in protest, but he refused to let go. With all the strength he could muster, Evan kicked toward the shore. The river fought against him, but his determination pushed him forward, inch by inch. By the time his fingers scraped the muddy bank, he felt like collapsing. With one final heave, Evan dragged the man onto the grass, collapsing beside him. He lay there for a moment, his chest heaving, every inch of his body aching. The afternoon sun was slipping lower now, and the river seemed calm once again, as if nothing had happened at all. Evan turned to the man, his eyes scanning for any sign of life. The stranger was older, maybe in his 60s, with a sharp jawline and fine features. A deep gash marred his temple, blood mixing with water as it trickled down his cheek. Evan's stomach turned at the sight, but then he noticed something, the faint rise and fall of the man's chest. "He's alive," Evan whispered, relief flooding through him. The man's breaths were shallow, and his body lay limp, but he was breathing. Evan sat up, wiping his wet hands on his jeans as he tried to think. His phone, he had left it back near his fishing rod. The hospital was miles away, and even if he found someone to help, there might not be enough time. Evan looked back at the man, his face pale and unmoving, and decided. "I am taking you home," he said softly, though his voice trembled. Rebecca was setting plates on the table when she heard the front door creak open. She turned to see Evan stumble in, soaked to the bone and shivering. But it was not just Evan. He was carrying someone, a man who looked unconscious, his clothes dripping water onto the floor. "Evan!" Rebecca cried, rushing over. "What on earth is going on?" "I found him in the river," Evan panted, his breath ragged. Someone threw him off the bridge. "He's alive, Mom. Barely." Rebecca stared at the stranger, shock and worry etched into her face. For a moment she hesitated, torn between calling the police and tending to the man's immediate injuries. "Please, Mom," Evan pleaded. "You have to help him." Rebecca's instincts kicked in. Without another word, she grabbed an old towel and began checking the man's pulse. Her hands moved quickly, her years as a waitress giving her a calm, steady touch. As she worked, Evan watched nervously, his heart still pounding. He had no idea who this man was or what trouble might follow him. All Evan knew was that he had made a choice, and choices, his father had once said, had a way of changing everything. Rebecca Miller worked quickly, her hands trembling slightly as she cleaned the blood from the man's temple. The towel turned red as she wiped away the dirt and river water, revealing the deep gash. She pressed gently against his wrist to check his pulse, frowning at the weak, uneven rhythm. "Is he going to be okay?" Evan's voice broke the silence, his tone a mixture of worry and exhaustion. Rebecca glanced at her son, still soaking wet and shivering in his jeans and tattered t-shirt. "I don't know, Evan. He's breathing, but we need to keep him warm." Rebecca turned to grab the thin blanket from the worn-out sofa, draping it over the man's unmoving body. Her eyes swept over his features, a man in his 60s maybe, with fine lines etched across his pale face and silver hair matted to his head. He looked distinguished, even now, but there was something fragile about him, like he had been worn down long before the river swallowed him. Rebecca's instincts told her to call the police or an ambulance, but something stopped her. Evan had said someone threw this man into the river. If that were true, this wasn't just an accident. Whoever had done this might still be out there, searching. "Mom?" Evan's voice pulled her back. Rebecca knelt in front of her son, brushing his wet bangs off his forehead. "You're soaked through. Go change into dry clothes before you get sick." "But what about him?" Evan asked, nodding toward the man. "You won't let him die, right?" Rebecca's chest tightened at the worry in his voice. "I won't," she promised softly. "I'll keep him stable. But you need to take care of yourself first. Go on now." Evan hesitated, his gaze lingering on the stranger before he finally turned and disappeared into the small hallway that led to his room. Rebecca stood slowly, wiping her damp hands on her apron. Her mind was a storm of questions. Who was this man? Who had thrown him into the river, and why? Evan sat on the edge of his bed, pulling on a pair of dry sweatpants and a faded hoodie. His hands were still trembling, though he wasn't sure if it was from the cold or the shock of what had happened. He replayed the scene on the bridge in his mind, the black car. The man shoved over the edge, the splash that still echoed in his ears. For a brief moment, Evan wondered what would have happened if he hadn't been there. Would anyone else have found the man? Would he have been carried away by the current, lost forever? "You did the right thing," Evan whispered to himself, though the knot of fear in his stomach remained. He stood and walked back toward the living room, pausing in the hallway when he heard his mother muttering to herself. "What do I do? What if whoever did this comes looking for him?" Rebecca whispered under her breath as she tucked the blanket closer around the man. "This is trouble. I can feel it." Evan stepped into the room, his voice hesitant. "Mom?" Rebecca turned sharply, her face softening when she saw him. "You're supposed to be resting." "I can't just sit there," Evan replied. "He's here because of me." Rebecca sighed, lowering herself onto the edge of the sofa. "You didn't put him in that river, Evan. You pulled him out. That's different." Evan stared at the man, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. "Do you think he'll wake up?" "I don't know," Rebecca admitted, glancing down at her hands. "The gash on his head worries me. If he doesn't come around soon, we'll have to figure something out. We can't keep him here forever." "We can't just leave him," Evan said quickly, his voice stronger than he expected. "If someone tried to kill him, they might still be out there. What if he's not safe?" Rebecca looked at her son, surprised by the determination in his voice. She had always worried about Evan, worried that life had hardened him too soon. But now, as she studied him, she saw a strength she hadn't noticed before. "We'll keep him here for the night," she said finally, though doubt lingered in her tone. "But if he doesn't wake up by morning, we're calling for help. I won't have this house become part of someone else's trouble." Evan nodded, his relief evident. "Okay." Hours passed, the house settling into an uneasy quiet. Rebecca checked on the man frequently, pressing damp towels to his forehead and watching his breathing. Each time, Evan hovered nearby, unable to sit still. He asked questions Rebecca could not answer. Who was he? Why had someone wanted him gone? And every answer Rebecca gave felt hollow. It was well past midnight when the stranger stirred. Evan had been dozing in the armchair, his head lolling against his shoulder, when he heard the faint groan. His eyes snapped open, and he sat up straight, watching the man shift slightly beneath the blanket. "Mom!" Evan called quietly, trying not to startle him. Rebecca appeared quickly, kneeling beside the sofa as the man's eyes fluttered open. His gaze was unfocused at first, darting around the room before finally settling on Rebecca's face. "Where?" The man's voice was raspy, barely more than a whisper. "You're safe," Rebecca said softly. "You're in my home. My son found you in the river." The man's brow furrowed, confusion clouding his pale face. "The river?" "Yes," Rebecca continued gently. "Do you remember how you got there?" The man closed his eyes for a moment, his expression pained. He lifted a trembling hand to his bandaged temple and winced when his fingers brushed the wound. "No," he muttered hoarsely. "It's fuzzy." "Do you know your name?" Rebecca pressed, though she kept her voice calm. There was a long pause. Finally, the man whispered, "Henry Parker." Evan, who had been standing quietly nearby, spoke up. "Mr. Parker, do you remember anything else? Someone threw you into the river. I saw it happen." Henry's eyes snapped open again, his gaze sharper this time. He turned his head slowly toward Evan, studying the boy for a moment before his expression softened. "You pulled me out?" Evan nodded. "Yes, sir." Henry let out a shaky breath, his hand dropping back onto the blanket. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Rebecca watched the exchange, her heart twisting as Henry's shoulders sagged with exhaustion. Whoever this man was, he had been through something terrible, something he was not ready to face. "You need rest," Rebecca said firmly. "We'll talk more in the morning." Henry nodded weakly, his eyes already closing again. Within moments, he was asleep. Evan sat on the edge of the armchair, his legs curled under him as he stared at the sleeping man. "Henry Parker," he whispered to himself. Rebecca, sitting across the room with a steaming mug of tea, sighed quietly. "He doesn't seem dangerous, but that doesn't mean we're out of the woods yet." Evan looked at her, frowning. "Do you think he's a bad guy?" "I don't know," Rebecca admitted. "But good people don't usually end up tossed into rivers. Someone wanted him dead, Evan. That's the kind of trouble we can't afford." Evan was quiet for a moment before he spoke. "I couldn't leave him there, Mom." Rebecca's expression softened. "I know, honey. You did the right thing." Evan looked back at Henry, his face calm now, in sleep. He wondered who Henry Parker really was, why someone had wanted him gone, and what secrets he carried. In the quiet of the night, Evan thought about his father's words once more. "Do the right thing, Ev, even when it's hard." Evan had saved a man's life, but deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The morning sunlight streamed through the cracked blinds of the living room window, cutting across the worn carpet and painting streaks of light on the floor. The air smelled faintly of strong coffee and antiseptic. Evan sat at the small kitchen table, the legs wobbling slightly every time he shifted. A bowl of cereal sat untouched in front of him, the milk turning warm as he pushed the spoon around absent-mindedly. He could hear his mother in the other room, moving quietly as she checked on Henry. Henry Parker. The name was still strange to Evan, and it sounded more like a character from a book than someone who was lying half-conscious on their couch. "Eat, Evan." Rebecca's voice broke his thoughts as she appeared in the doorway, her face tired but stern. She carried a half-empty coffee mug, steam still curling off the surface. Evan looked up at her. "How is he?" He's stable, she said, leaning against the counter and cradling the coffee in both hands. Still weak. I don't think he remembers much yet, though. Kept asking where he was before falling asleep again. Evan frowned. Do you think he'll get better? Rebecca took a slow sip of her coffee, her eyes focused on a spot just above Evan's head. I hope so. But I also hope he remembers what happened soon. Why? Rebecca lowered the cup, her eyes meeting Evan's. Because if someone was willing to toss him into a river, they might come back to finish the job. The words hung in the air like a shadow. Evan's stomach twisted, and he finally took a small bite of his cereal just to have something to do. The thought of someone showing up at their front door looking for Henry made his skin prickle with unease. You're not going back to the river today, Rebecca added sharply. Evan's head snapped up. Why not? Because it's not safe, she said, her tone brooking no argument. I don't want you out there alone right now. And I mean it, Evan. Don't argue with me. Evan clamped his mouth shut and nodded reluctantly. He hated the idea of not going to the river. It was the one place where everything felt still, where the weight of their struggles seemed to lift. But his mother's expression left no room for debate. Henry woke just before noon. When Evan peeked into the living room, he saw the older man propped up against a couple of cushions, the blanket still wrapped tightly around him. Henry's face looked less pale now, though deep lines etched into his skin gave him a weary look. Rebecca sat in the armchair across from him, her arms crossed and her expression guarded. Morning, Evan said softly, stepping into the room. Henry turned his head, his gray eyes settling on Evan with surprising clarity. You must be the boy who pulled me out. Evan nodded, hesitating before sitting on the edge of the couch across the room. I'm Evan. Henry offered a faint smile, the corners of his mouth barely lifting. Thank you, Evan. His voice was low and gravelly, but there was sincerity in it that made Evan's cheeks warm. How are you feeling? Rebecca asked, still watching Henry carefully. Henry tilted his head back, staring at the ceiling for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. Alive, thanks to you, he murmured. Sore, fuzzy in the head. He paused, his brow furrowing. But I suppose it could be worse. Rebecca leaned forward slightly. Do you remember anything, Mr. Parker? Henry's eyes narrowed, his gaze dropping to his lap. His hands, trembling slightly, rested on the blanket as he stared at them. For a long moment, he did not answer. Then, quietly, he said, Some of it. Evan sat up straighter. Like what? Henry's eyes flicked up to meet Evan's before shifting to Rebecca. I was in my car, he said, his voice slow and deliberate, as though testing each word. It was late. I was meeting someone. Then, he trailed off, pressing a hand to his temple and wincing. Then what? Rebecca pressed gently. Henry shook his head, frustrated. I don't know. It's like trying to grab smoke. I remember voices, a struggle. And then, he broke off suddenly, his expression darkening. And then the water. A chill ran down Evan's spine as he remembered the splash, the way the man had fallen so lifelessly into the river. Who were you meeting? Rebecca asked. Henry's jaw tightened, and for a moment it seemed like he might not answer. Then finally he muttered, Someone I trusted. Rebecca frowned, leaning back in her chair. That doesn't explain why someone tried to kill you. No, it doesn't, Henry agreed, his voice hardening. But I think I know why. Evan and Rebecca both stared at him, waiting. Henry shifted slightly, his hands clutching the blanket. Before all this happened, I started looking into some financial discrepancies in my business. I ran a small company. Someone close to me had access to everything. And I started seeing patterns. Money going missing. Deals that didn't add up. Like someone was stealing from you? Evan asked. Henry nodded grimly. Yes, I think they found out I was catching on. And when I confronted them... He paused, his expression growing haunted. They decided it was easier if I disappeared. The room fell silent for a long moment. Rebecca's gaze was sharp, searching Henry's face for any sign of deception. "You don't have to believe me," Henry said softly, sensing her doubt. "But it's the truth." Rebecca sighed, rubbing her temples. "I want to believe you, Henry. But you need to understand something. My son brought you here because he wanted to help. But this is my home. If trouble follows you here, we can't afford to take that risk." Henry's eyes softened as he looked at her. "I understand, and I promise I will leave as soon as I'm able." Rebecca nodded curtly and stood up. "Evan, come help me in the kitchen." Evan frowned but followed her into the small kitchen, where Rebecca turned to face him, lowering her voice. "I don't trust him yet." "But Mom, he's telling the truth," Evan argued. "Why else would someone try to kill him?" Rebecca's face softened slightly. "Maybe, but we don't know his story for sure. And we don't know who might be looking for him." Evan's shoulders slumped. "He's not dangerous, Mom. I can tell." Rebecca sighed, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'm not saying we abandon him, Evan. I just need to keep you safe first." That afternoon, Henry managed to get out of bed and sit at the kitchen table with Evan, while Rebecca reluctantly made him some soup. Henry ate slowly, his hands trembling slightly, but there was a quiet strength in his movements. "You're a good kid, Evan," Henry said suddenly, breaking the silence. Evan looked up, startled. "What?" Henry set the spoon down and studied him for a moment. "Not many people would have done what you did, jumping into a river to save a stranger. That's brave." Evan shifted uncomfortably, his cheeks warming. I couldn't leave you there." Henry smiled faintly. "It means something, more than you know." Rebecca, who was washing dishes at the sink, turned her head slightly to listen, though she said nothing. Henry's voice grew softer. "Kindness has a way of coming back around, Evan. I learned that the hard way." Evan frowned, curiosity getting the better of him. "What do you mean?" Henry's gaze drifted to the window, his expression distant. "Sometimes we forget how much a single moment of kindness can change everything, until someone reminds us." That evening, as the house settled into silence once again, Evan lay in bed staring at the ceiling. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, full of worry and warning. Henry's words lingered too, about trust, betrayal, and kindness. Evan thought about the river, about the way Henry had looked when he pulled him from the water. He thought about his father, too, and how he had always taught Evan to look out for others, even when it was hard. Kindness has a way of coming back around. Evan didn't know what was coming next, but deep down, he felt it something bigger was happening, and somehow he was a part of it now. The next morning, the sky was overcast, a blanket of gray clouds hanging low and heavy. A cool breeze drifted through the small two-bedroom house, stirring the thin curtains and leaving a chill in the air. Evan stood at the window, peeking out through the narrow crack between the blinds. The street was quiet, like it usually was, but his eyes lingered on a black sedan parked across the road. It looked out of place in their neighborhood, where most cars were rusted trucks or old family sedans. This car was sleek, shiny, and silent, almost predatory. "Evan," Rebecca called sharply from the kitchen, "eat your breakfast before it gets cold." Evan stepped away from the window reluctantly, but his mind stayed on that car. Something about it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. As he sat down at the wobbly table, he glanced at Henry, who was nursing a cup of tea. Henry still looked weak. Dark circles hung under his eyes, and though his face had regained some color, his movements were slow and careful, as though he might break apart if he moved too quickly. But his gaze was sharp, constantly scanning the room as if he expected something or someone to appear at any moment. Rebecca placed a plate of eggs and toast in front of Evan and sat down with her own coffee. She looked at Henry with an unreadable expression. "How are you feeling this morning?" Henry lowered the mug carefully, his hands steady for the first time since he arrived. "Better," he said softly, though his voice still carried a rough edge. "Thank you, both of you." Rebecca nodded, her face softening a little. "You're lucky Evan was there when he was." Henry looked at Evan, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Luck had nothing to do with it. Evan looked down at his plate, his face flushing. He wasn't used to people giving him credit for anything. Rebecca broke the silence. "Mr. Parker, if someone is looking for you—" "They are," Henry interrupted, his voice firm but calm. Rebecca paused, narrowing her eyes. "Then you need to tell us the truth. What exactly happened to you?" Henry sighed deeply, leaning back in his chair. He looked out the window for a long moment before answering, his tone quiet but clear. "I trusted the wrong person," he said finally. "A man I thought was like family. His name is Mason Hayes." Rebecca frowned. "Who is he to you?" Henry's gaze hardened, his fingers wrapping tightly around the edge of the table. "A former business partners. I built my company from the ground up, put my trust in Mason when we expanded. He handled accounts, investments, contracts, all of it. But I started noticing little things, discrepancies that didn't make sense. I confronted him about it, and that's when everything turned." "What do you mean?" Evan asked, his fork halfway to his mouth. Henry's voice dropped slightly. "He told me I was mistaken, that I was seeing problems where there weren't any, but I didn't let it go. I started digging deeper, checking records myself. That's when I found it proof that Mason had been stealing from the company for years. Millions of dollars moved through shell accounts and fake businesses. He must have known I was onto him because the night before I ended up in the river, I told him we needed to talk." Rebecca's face tightened. "So, you think Mason did this?" Henry nodded, his jaw clenching. "I don't think I know. I remember meeting him. I confronted him, showed him the evidence. The last thing I remember is Mason yelling, saying I'd ruined everything. Then," his voice trailed off, his gaze distant. "Then I woke up here." A heavy silence fell over the table. Rebecca ran a hand through her hair, her fingers brushing against her tired face. "And now he's looking for you," she said quietly. Henry met her eyes. "Yes, Mason will send people to find me, and if they realize I'm alive, they'll come after anyone who's helped me." Evan's stomach sank at the words. He looked at his mother, whose face had gone pale. "Mom?" Rebecca stood abruptly, picking up her empty coffee mug and walking to the sink. Her voice was calm, but the edge in her tone was unmistakable. "Then you can't stay here." "Mom!" Evan blurted, his chair scraping against the floor as he stood. "You're not serious!" Rebecca turned to face him, her arms crossed. "I am serious, Evan. I let you talk me into this, but now I see how dangerous it is. If these people find him here, they'll hurt all of us." "Rebecca," Henry said gently, his voice steady, "I understand. I don't want to bring trouble to your doorstep. I'll leave as soon as I'm able." "You're not strong enough to leave yet," Evan said stubbornly. "And where would you even go?" Henry's face softened as he looked at Evan. "I'll figure something out." Evan shook his head, his fists clenching at his sides. "That's not fair. He's in trouble, and we can't just throw him out." "Evan," Rebecca said firmly, "this isn't up for discussion." The rest of the day passed in tense silence. Henry stayed in the living room, flipping through an old newspaper Evan found under the coffee table, while Rebecca busied herself cleaning the house. Evan spent most of the afternoon on the front porch, his arms folded tightly across his chest as he watched the black sedan across the street. It was still there, sitting quietly like a predator waiting to pounce. Evan couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was in that car knew something. By evening, Evan had had enough. As the sun set behind the clouds, turning the sky a murky orange, he slipped back inside and walked straight into the living room. "Mr. Parker," Evan said, his voice quiet but determined, Do you have a plan? Henry looked up from the paper, surprised by the sudden question. A plan? To stop Mason, Evan clarified. To prove what he did. You said you had evidence. Henry sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. The evidence is locked in my office safe at my house. Mason doesn't know I kept hard copies of everything: bank statements, contracts, signatures. If I can get to that, I can prove what he's done. Then let's go get it, Evan said quickly. Henry smiled faintly. It's not that simple, Evan. Mason has men watching my house. I can't just walk in there. Maybe you can't, Evan said, his voice rising slightly. But what if someone else could? Someone they wouldn't expect. Henry's smile faded. You're talking about yourself. Evan nodded. They wouldn't think I'm involved. I could sneak in and… Absolutely not. Rebecca's voice cut in from the hallway. She had been listening the whole time, her face pale with anger. Evan, you are not going anywhere near that man's house. Mom, I can help, Evan protested. You've done enough already, Rebecca snapped, her voice shaking. Henry, I'm sorry, but I can't let you drag my son into this. Henry held up his hands in surrender. Rebecca, I would never ask him to. Rebecca turned to Henry, her expression hard. You need to leave as soon as you're able. Tomorrow. Evan opened his mouth to argue, but Henry spoke first, his voice calm and steady. I understand, he said softly. That night, Evan lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. He could hear the faint hum of cars passing in the distance and the creak of the house settling. Somewhere outside, the black sedan still sat. His mother's words echoed in his mind. You've done enough already. But had he? Evan had saved Henry's life. But what good was it if Mason Hayes got away with everything? Henry would still be in danger, and Mason would never face justice. Evan rolled onto his side, staring at the faint shadow of the window. He thought about the river, the cold water pulling at his legs, and the way Henry's face looked so lifeless before he dragged him to shore. Kindness has a way of coming back around, Henry had said. Evan didn't know exactly how, but he felt it deep in his gut he could not let this go. Outside, a car door clicked shut, and the shadow of someone moving outside his window sent a chill straight down Evan's spine. The sound of a car door shutting outside made Evan's heart hammer in his chest. He sat up in bed, his breath catching in his throat. The shadow that had moved past his window was gone now, but the faint glow of headlights bled through the thin curtains. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his bare feet hitting the cold floor. Holding his breath, he crept toward the window, parting the curtains just enough to see outside. The black sedan was still there, but now two figures stood beside it, barely visible in the dim glow of the streetlight. One of them leaned against the car casually, arms crossed, while the other paced back and forth with quick, restless movements. They're watching us, Evan thought, his stomach turning. Suddenly, one of the men pointed toward the house. Evan's pulse spiked as he dropped the curtain and backed away from the window. He stumbled into the hallway, his breathing shallow as he ran straight for the living room. Mom! Evan whispered loudly, shaking Rebecca awake. Rebecca shot upright, her eyes wide with confusion. What is it? She muttered, brushing her hair from her face. There's someone outside, Evan said urgently. The car. 2 men. They're watching the house. Rebecca's exhaustion vanished in an instant. She stood quickly, her expression hardening as she crossed the room and peeked out through the living room window. Her shoulders tensed. Stay here, she told Evan, her voice low and sharp. Mom, don't! I said stay here, Rebecca snapped quietly, her eyes locking onto his. Do you hear me? Evan bit back his protest and nodded reluctantly. Rebecca moved quickly into the kitchen, grabbing the old landline phone they kept on the wall. She pressed the receiver to her ear, muttering, Come on, come on. But the line buzzed with a dull, empty hum. No signal, she murmured under her breath, her jaw tightening. Henry, now awake and sitting upright on the living room sofa, watched her carefully. "They cut the line," he said quietly. Rebecca turned to face him. "What do they want?" "They're Mason's men," Henry said grimly. "They've come to find me." "Then we have a problem," Rebecca replied sharply. "Because you're here." Evan watched from the hallway as his mother and Henry exchanged a tense look. He felt like a small child standing on the edge of something enormous and terrifying, something he didn't fully understand. "What do we do?" Evan asked, stepping into the room. Rebecca turned toward him, her face pale but determined. "We're going to keep them out," she said firmly. "Evan, I want you to stay close to me. Do you understand?" Evan nodded, his heart still pounding. Henry shifted his weight, wincing slightly as he stood up. "Rebecca, I don't want to put your family in danger." "It's too late for that," Rebecca snapped. "Those men are already here." The pounding on the front door came just minutes later. Bang! 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 The noise echoed through the small house, making Rebecca's hands tremble as she locked the deadbolt. "Stay back," she whispered to Evan, who hovered near the hallway. From the other side of the door, a man's voice called out, "We know you're in there, Parker. Open up, and nobody has to get hurt." Rebecca clenched her fists, her eyes narrowing. "Get off my porch," she shouted back. "Lady, this doesn't concern you," the voice replied, his tone cold and even. "Just hand him over, and we'll leave." "I don't think so," Rebecca shot back. There was a long pause. Then the man's voice turned hard. "You don't want to make this worse." Henry moved quietly to the side window, peering through a small crack in the curtains. His face darkened. "They're not bluffing," he murmured. "One of them has a crowbar." Evan's breath caught in his throat. "What are we going to do?" Rebecca turned to Henry, her voice low but firm. "Is there another way out of here? Somewhere we can go?" Henry shook his head. "If we go out the back, they'll see us. We're boxed in." The pounding on the door grew louder, more insistent. "Last chance," the man shouted. Crash. The sound of glass shattering in the kitchen sent Rebecca spinning around. A rock had come through the small window above the sink, landing on the linoleum floor with a heavy thud. The two men outside weren't waiting anymore. "Get to my room," Rebecca ordered Evan, her voice sharp. "Lock the door and stay there." "No," Evan protested. "I'm not leaving you." "Evan," Rebecca snapped, grabbing his shoulders and forcing him to look at her. "Listen to me. You have to do what I say. Now go." Evan swallowed hard, his eyes stinging, but he nodded. Without another word, he turned and ran down the hall, his bare feet slapping against the floor as he disappeared into his mother's bedroom. Rebecca grabbed a kitchen knife, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle. Henry, standing close beside her, picked up a heavy fire poker from near the living room stove. "If they get in," Henry murmured, "we stall them, long enough for Evan to hide." Rebecca nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "They won't take you," she said quietly, more to herself than to Henry. The front door rattled violently as the men outside began forcing it open. The deadbolt groaned, the wood splintering under the pressure. Finally, with a sharp crack, the door burst open. Two men stepped inside. The first was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark leather jacket. His face was hard, his eyes cold as they scanned the room. Behind him stood another man, wiry and nervous, holding the crowbar tightly in one hand. "Where is he?" the man in the jacket demanded, his voice a low growl. Rebecca stepped forward, holding the knife out in front of her. "Get out of my house." The man smirked, his gaze flicking between her and Henry. "You're making a mistake, lady. Just give us Parker, and we'll leave you alone." "I said get out!" Rebecca shouted, her voice shaking. The wiry man stepped closer, raising the crowbar threateningly. "You don't want to do this." Before he could finish, Henry swung the fire poker with surprising force, striking the crowbar and knocking it from the man's hand. The man stumbled back, swearing loudly. "Go!" Henry yelled at Rebecca. "Get Evan!" Rebecca hesitated for only a second before turning and running toward the hallway. Behind her, she heard the sounds of Henry struggling with the two men, the scuffle of feet, the clatter of metal on the floor. She reached the bedroom door, her hands shaking as she twisted the knob. "Evan!" The door opened, and she found Evan crouched in the corner, his arms wrapped tightly around his knees. He looked up at her, his face pale with fear. "Come on," Rebecca whispered, pulling him to his feet. "We're leaving." "But what about Henry?" Evan asked, his voice small. Rebecca hesitated, guilt flashing across her face. "He's buying us time. We have to go." Back in the living room, Henry staggered as the man in the leather jacket shoved him hard against the wall. The wiry man picked up the crowbar again, his face twisted with anger. "Where's the evidence, Parker?" the man growled. "You think you're going to ruin Mason? You think he'll let you?" Henry coughed, struggling to catch his breath. "You'll never find it," he muttered. The man sneered, raising the crowbar. Suddenly, the sound of distant sirens echoed in the air. Both men froze, exchanging a sharp look. "Cops!" the wiry man hissed. "Let's go!" the man in the leather jacket barked. With a final glare at Henry, the two men bolted for the front door, disappearing into the gray morning. Henry slumped against the wall, his body aching, as the sound of their car's engine roared to life. He exhaled shakily, closing his eyes as the sirens grew louder. Rebecca and Evan watched from the edge of the back porch as the police cars pulled up to the house, their lights flashing red and blue. Henry sat on the front steps, bruised and battered, but alive. Evan turned to his mother, his voice trembling. "We can't leave him now, Mom. We have to help him." Rebecca looked at her son, seeing the resolve in his eyes. For a long moment, she was silent. Then, finally, she nodded. "All right," she said softly. "We'll help him." Evan's shoulders relaxed as he let out a shaky breath. Somewhere deep down, he knew this was far from over. But as the sun began to break through the clouds, Evan felt a spark of hope. They were in this together now, and for the first time in a long while, he wasn't afraid. The house felt different now, taut with unease, like a string stretched to its breaking point. The front door had been patched up with spare wood planks, but the splintered frame and shattered kitchen window remained grim reminders of what had happened. Rebecca kept glancing toward them as though expecting the men to return at any moment. Evan sat on the edge of the sofa, clutching a mug of hot cocoa. The warmth seeped through his hands, but he barely felt it. His mind kept replaying the chaos of the night before the crash of the door, the sound of footsteps, the crowbar swinging through the air. He had never been so scared in his life. Across the room, Henry sat quietly, a fresh bruise blooming along his jaw and a bandage covering his temple. Despite the pain, he looked steady, his expression calm in a way that seemed almost unshakable. It was the first time Evan realized just how much Henry had been through already. The police had arrived only moments after Mason's men fled. 2 cruisers, lights flashing, had pulled up to the house, and the officers had bombarded Rebecca and Henry with questions. The men were gone by the time they arrived, leaving behind nothing but broken glass and a shaken family. "Did you see their faces?" the officer had asked Henry. "No," Henry had replied firmly. "It all happened so fast." Evan had wanted to speak up to tell them everything he knew about Mason Hayes, about the black sedan parked on the street for days, but something held him back. Maybe it was the look on Henry's face, a quiet warning not to say too much. Or maybe it was fear that talking would bring more trouble to their doorstep. Now, hours later, the 3 of them sat in the living room, the tension thick and unmoving. Rebecca stood near the window, her arms crossed tightly, watching the street like a hawk. "They'll come back," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. "I know they will." "They might," Henry admitted softly, "but we won't let them catch us off guard again." Rebecca turned toward him, her frustration bubbling to the surface. Catch us off guard? You say that like this is our fight. My son is terrified, Henry. My house has been broken into. And all because you brought your trouble here. Henry's face remained calm, though a shadow passed behind his eyes. You're right, he said quietly. You didn't ask for this. But I didn't ask for someone to try and kill me either. Rebecca exhaled sharply, her anger fading as quickly as it had come. She sank into the armchair, rubbing her temples. I just don't know how we're supposed to keep going like this. Henry leaned forward, his voice low but steady. The only way out of this is to face it head on. If we don't stop Mason now, he'll keep coming. He won't stop until he's certain I can't ruin him. Rebecca looked at him, her eyes narrowing. And what do you suggest? You can barely stand up straight. I won't be doing it alone, Henry said, his gaze shifting to Evan. Evan blinked, his back stiffening. Me? Henry nodded. You're braver than most grown men I know, Evan. And you're right about one thing: those men wouldn't expect a kid like you to get involved. Rebecca sat up, her voice sharp. Absolutely not. Evan is not going anywhere near Mason Hayes. Mom, Evan started, but she cut him off with a glare. I mean it, Evan. You've done enough already. Henry held up a hand. Rebecca, listen. I'm not suggesting we put Evan in harm's way, but if we want to get the evidence from my house, we'll need a plan. And it's a plan that relies on Mason underestimating us. Rebecca frowned, her arms crossing again. What kind of plan? Henry's voice was steady as he explained. Mason has his men watching the house. They'll be looking for me, probably expecting me to sneak in at night or try to hide. But if Evan goes during the day, casually they won't see him as a threat. He can get inside, grab what we need from the safe, and leave before anyone notices. Rebecca shook her head immediately. No, absolutely not. You think they wouldn't notice a kid sneaking into the house? They're criminals, Henry, not idiots. Henry looked at her, his expression gentle but firm. It's the best chance we have, and I'll make sure Evan knows exactly where to go and what to do. He won't be alone. I'll stay close by, watching the house. Rebecca was silent, her jaw tight as she glanced at Evan. You don't seriously think you can do this, do you? Evan swallowed hard, but when he spoke, his voice was steady. I do. Rebecca's face softened slightly. Why, Evan? Why do you want to get involved? Because it's the right thing to do, Evan said quietly, meeting her gaze. I couldn't leave him in the river, and I can't leave him now. If Mason gets away with this, Henry's life is still in danger, and maybe ours too. Rebecca looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she turned to Henry. How do you know this will work? I don't, Henry admitted, but I do know that without that evidence, Mason will win. He'll bury what he's done, and he won't think twice about coming after me or anyone else who gets in his way. Rebecca sighed heavily, running a hand through her hair. I can't believe I'm agreeing to this. Mom, I can do it, Evan said firmly. You'll see. She looked at her son, seeing the determination in his eyes. It scared her, how much he had grown in just a few days, how the boy who used to hide in the shadows now stood tall, unshaken by the danger around him. All right, she said finally, though her voice was tight with worry. But if anything feels wrong, you get out of there. Do you understand me? I understand, Evan promised. By the time the sun began to set, the plan was in place. Henry had drawn a map of the house on an old piece of paper, marking the exact location of the safe in his office. It's under the desk, Henry explained, pointing to the rough sketch, behind a loose floorboard. The code is 72314. You'll need to move fast. If anyone shows up, you drop everything and get out. The evidence isn't worth your life. I've got it, Evan said, studying the map carefully. Henry placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm. You're braver than you know, Evan. I wouldn't trust just anyone to do this. Rebecca stood in the corner of the room, her arms crossed tightly as she watched the two of them. "You'd better come back in one piece," she muttered. "I will," Evan promised. That night, Evan lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The sound of his mother pacing the living room reached his ears, each step echoing like a drumbeat. He knew she was worried, so was he. His mind raced with the details of the plan. He pictured himself walking up to Henry's house, slipping inside unnoticed, finding the safe, and grabbing the files. It sounds simple, he told himself. But deep down, he knew it would be anything but. The image of Mason's men, cold, hard-faced, and dangerous, kept surfacing in his mind, sending chills down his spine. But every time fear started to creep in, Evan thought about the river, about how Henry had been tossed aside like he didn't matter. Henry mattered, and Evan wasn't going to let someone like Mason win. "Kindness has a way of coming back around," Henry had said. Evan believed that now. He didn't know how or when, but he believed it. At dawn, Evan sat on the edge of the porch, waiting for Henry to join him. The map was tucked safely into his jacket pocket, along with a flashlight and an old screwdriver Henry had given him, just in case, Henry had said. As the sun crept over the horizon, Henry appeared, his limp still noticeable as he walked toward Evan. "Ready?" Henry asked quietly. Evan nodded. "I'm ready." Henry placed a hand on his shoulder. "Remember, Evan, you're braver than you think." Evan took a deep breath, his heart steady now. "Let's do this." Together, they turned toward the road, the weight of the morning settling over them like a heavy fog. The sun was barely rising when Evan and Henry stood at the edge of an overgrown lot across the street from Henry's house. The neighborhood sat quiet and still, draped in the gray haze of early morning. The only sounds came from a few distant birds and the faint hum of wind brushing through the trees. Henry's house sat in the center of it all, larger than Evan expected, but eerily lifeless. The white paint on the siding was peeling, and the windows, once pristine, looked abandoned. A black SUV was parked across the street, its tinted windows glinting faintly in the light. Henry had been right, Mason's men were watching. Henry crouched beside Evan, pointing through the brush. "See that side door there?" he whispered. "It leads into the laundry room. It's less likely they'll be watching it closely." Evan nodded, his pulse thudding loudly in his ears. He could feel his hands shaking despite his best efforts to keep calm. "You're sure you know where to go?" Henry asked softly, though his voice carried the weight of worry. "Under the desk, loose floorboard. Code 7314, Evan recited quietly, determined. Henry gave him a faint, reassuring smile. "That's right. You get in, grab the files, and get out. Don't stay longer than you have to. If anything feels wrong, you leave. Do you understand?" "I understand," Evan replied, though his voice was smaller than he wanted it to be. Henry placed a steadying hand on Evan's shoulder. "You can do this," he said firmly. "Remember, they won't expect you. You'll be in and out before they realize it." Evan took a deep breath, trying to push down the fear curling in his chest. "I'm ready." Henry nodded, glancing once more toward the SUV, before stepping back deeper into the brush. "I'll keep watch from here. If anything goes wrong, I'll signal you." Evan stood slowly, his hands clutching the map Henry had given him. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, like invisible weights pulling at his ankles. But he pushed forward, focusing on the side door Henry had pointed out. "You're braver than you think," Henry's voice echoed in his mind. The yard was quiet, but every creak of a branch or rustle of a leaf made Evan flinch. He crept along the side of the house, keeping low and close to the peeling walls. The air felt cold, even though the sun was rising, and his palms were slick with sweat. When he reached the side door, he paused, pressing his back against the wall and listening. Nothing. Evan exhaled slowly, reaching for the doorknob. It turned easily under his hand, and he eased the door open, the hinges groaning faintly in protest. He slipped inside, closing the door quietly behind him. The laundry room was small and dusty, with piles of old clothes stacked in the corner. Evan's sneakers made soft scuffing noises against the tile as he moved forward, his breathing shallow. He peeked through the doorway into the hallway beyond. The house was dark, the curtains drawn tight, and every shadow seemed to stretch long and menacing. "You can do this," he reminded himself. He followed Henry's map through the hallway, stepping carefully to avoid the loose boards that creaked beneath his weight. The office was near the back of the house, its door slightly ajar. Evan slipped inside, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure someone could hear it. The office looked just like Henry had described. A large wooden desk sat against the far wall, the surface cluttered with papers and an old lamp. A thick layer of dust covered everything, as if the house itself had been holding its breath since Henry disappeared. Evan crouched by the desk, feeling along the floorboards until his fingers found the loose one Henry had mentioned. It came up with a faint pop, revealing a small metal safe bolted to the floor. He hesitated only for a moment before spinning the lock. 7314, he whispered under his breath, carefully turning the dial. When the lock clicked open, Evan exhaled sharply, relief flooding through him. He swung the safe door open, his hands fumbling as he pulled out a thick folder. It was heavier than he expected, the papers inside crisp and neat, but Evan didn't stop to look. He shoved the folder into his backpack, zipped it shut, and stood. "Get out." He turned toward the door, moving quickly, but something stopped him cold. A sound. From somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. Evan froze, his breath catching in his throat. He stood perfectly still, straining his ears, but the house had gone quiet again. Maybe it was nothing, he thought desperately. Maybe the house just creaked on its own. But then he heard it again. A soft thud. Footsteps. Someone was inside. Evan's heart raced as he crouched down behind the desk, pressing his back against the wood. He clutched the straps of his backpack tightly, trying to keep his breath silent. From the hallway, the footsteps grew louder, deliberate and slow. A door creaked open, maybe the kitchen, maybe the living room, and then there was silence again. Evan's mind screamed at him to move, to run, but his body refused to listen. He could feel his pulse throbbing in his ears as he squeezed his eyes shut, praying whoever it was would leave. But the footsteps came closer. A voice low and sharp broke the silence. "Someone's been here." Evan's chest tightened. He peeked over the edge of the desk, just enough to see through the crack in the office door. Two men stood in the hallway, their backs to him. One of them was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing the same leather jacket Evan had seen the night before. The other man was smaller and wiry, holding a flashlight that cut through the dark like a knife. "Check the rooms," the taller man ordered. "He might have come back for something." The wiry man nodded, turning toward the office door. Evan ducked back down, panic clawing at his chest. "They're coming," he thought frantically. "They're going to find me." He glanced around the room, searching desperately for a way out. His eyes landed on the small window above the desk. It was narrow, but it might be big enough for him to squeeze through. The doorknob rattled. Evan's breath caught. Without thinking, he bolted for the window. He climbed onto the desk, pushing the window open with all his strength. The old frame groaned loudly, but it gave way. "Hey!" a voice shouted from behind him. Evan didn't look back. He threw his backpack through the window first, then scrambled up, his legs kicking against the desk as he pushed himself through the narrow opening. He felt hands graze his ankle, but he pulled free, tumbling out onto the grass below. "Get him!" the voice yelled. Evan didn't stop to think. He grabbed his backpack, scrambled to his feet, and ran. The world blurred around him as Evan sprinted across the yard, the grass wet beneath his sneakers. Behind him, he could hear the men shouting, their footsteps pounding against the ground. He reached the overgrown lot where Henry was waiting, hidden behind the thick brush. "Evan?" Henry's voice called softly. Evan nearly collapsed as he reached him, gasping for air. They saw me," he choked out, clutching the straps of his backpack. Henry's face went pale, but he grabbed Evan's arm, pulling him deeper into the brush. "Come on! We need to move!" Together, they stumbled through the lot, ducking low as they heard the men's shouts growing fainter. By the time they reached the road, Evan's legs felt like jelly, and his chest burned with every breath. Henry stopped, crouching beside him. "Are you hurt?" Evan shook his head, still trying to catch his breath. "I got it," he whispered, pulling the folder out of his backpack. "The papers. I got them." Henry stared at the folder, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he looked at Evan, his face softening. "You did good, Evan. Better than good." Evan managed a small, shaky smile. Despite the fear still coursing through him, he felt a flicker of pride. "What now?" he asked. Henry glanced toward the horizon, his expression turning serious. "Now we take this to someone who can stop Mason." Evan nodded, tightening his grip on the backpack. For the first time, he felt like they had a real chance. Mason might have power and men on his side, but Evan wasn't afraid anymore. They had the truth, and the truth was powerful enough to bring anyone down. Evan's legs still burned from running, but he forced himself to keep moving. Henry walked quickly beside him, his limp more pronounced now, but his grip on Evan's arm was steady. Together, they stayed low as they crossed through the overgrown field behind Henry's old house, sticking to the cover of the trees. Every now and then, Henry would glance back, scanning for signs of Mason's men. "Are they still behind us?" Evan whispered, trying to catch his breath. Henry shook his head, but kept moving. "They'll check the house first. We bought ourselves a little time, but not much." The folder full of evidence weighed heavily in Evan's backpack, the papers inside rustling faintly with each step. He couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened, how close those men had come to catching him. The image of the wiry man lunging for his ankle kept replaying in his mind, sending shivers down his spine. "Where are we going?" Evan asked finally, his voice low but urgent. "To someone we can trust," Henry replied. "My lawyer, Andrew Porter. He's the only one who knows everything about my company and Mason's dealings. If we get this to him, he can take it straight to the authorities." Evan frowned. "Are you sure we can trust him?" Henry glanced down at Evan, a faint smile softening his face. "I've known Andrew for 30 years. He's not the kind of man who bends to pressure, and he won't turn his back on me now." They pushed through a break in the trees and emerged onto a narrow side road. It stretched ahead of them, empty and quiet, flanked by thick woods on both sides. Henry slowed, leaning slightly against a tree as he caught his breath. "You okay?" Evan asked, concern flickering across his face. Henry nodded, though the lines on his face looked deeper now. "I'm fine. We just need to keep moving." He gestured down the road. "There's a bus stop a mile or so from here. We'll take the bus into town. Mason's men won't think to look for us on public transportation." Evan's eyes widened. "We're taking a bus?" Henry smiled faintly. "Not exactly glamorous, I know, but it's the safest option right now." Evan nodded reluctantly and adjusted the straps of his backpack. The folder felt heavier by the second, as though it carried the weight of everything that had happened. "Let's go then." They reached the bus stop just as the morning traffic began to pick up. The stop was little more than a bench and a dented sign on the edge of the road, but it felt like a lifeline. Henry sat down heavily, rubbing his leg as he scanned the road. Evan stood nearby, shifting nervously from one foot to the other. He kept his eyes on the passing cars, half expecting to see the black SUV roaring toward them. "Do you think they'll figure out where we're going?" Evan asked quietly. Henry shook his head. "Not yet. They'll be too busy tearing apart the house to look for us here. We just have to stay ahead of them long enough to get to Andrew." Evan nodded, though the knot of worry in his chest didn't loosen. After a few tense minutes, the bus finally appeared down the road, its engine rumbling as it slowed to a stop in front of them. The doors opened with a hiss, and Henry stood with a grunt, steadying himself with one hand on Evan's shoulder. "Come on," he muttered. The bus was mostly empty. Henry slid into a seat near the back, letting out a quiet sigh as he sank into the worn cushion. Evan sat beside him, clutching his backpack tightly against his chest. As the bus pulled back onto the road, Evan stared out the window, watching the trees and houses blur past. It felt strange to be surrounded by so much normalcy, people walking their dogs, kids riding bikes, workers heading to their jobs while his own world was spinning wildly out of control. Henry seemed to sense his thoughts. "You doing all right?" he asked softly. Evan glanced at him, hesitating. "I guess, just, everything feels so big, you know?" Henry nodded, his face thoughtful. "It's because you're in the middle of it. But you're doing more than most grown men would, Evan. Don't forget that." Evan looked down at the backpack in his lap. "I just want this to be over." "It will be," Henry promised. "When the truth comes out, Mason won't be able to hide anymore." The bus pulled into town nearly an hour later, stopping in front of a small park where kids were already playing on the swings. Henry led Evan off the bus, moving slower now, his limp more noticeable. "Where does your lawyer live?" Evan asked, glancing around nervously. "Not far," Henry replied, nodding toward a small street lined with modest houses. "We'll walk the rest of the way. Andrew's office is just a few blocks from here." They started down the sidewalk, sticking close to the buildings and moving quickly. Evan's eyes darted to every car that passed, looking for the black SUV. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. Halfway down the block, Henry stopped suddenly. "What is it?" Evan asked, his voice low. Henry's gaze had locked onto a dark sedan parked across the street. It wasn't Mason's black SUV, but something about the way it sat there, silent, with tinted windows, sent chills down Evan's spine. "They're here," Henry murmured. Evan's heart began to pound. "What do we do?" Henry scanned the street quickly, his mind racing. "We're close to Andrew's office. We can make it there before they figure out where we're going." "But what if they see us?" Evan asked, glancing nervously at the car. "They probably already have," Henry replied grimly. "But if we run, they'll know we're onto them. So we act normal." Evan swallowed hard, his palms sweaty against the straps of his backpack. He followed Henry as they crossed the street, walking briskly, but not running. Henry kept his gaze forward, but Evan couldn't help glancing back at the car. The driver's side door opened. Evan's pulse spiked. "Henry." "Keep walking," Henry said through gritted teeth. A man stepped out of the sedan, dressed in a dark suit with sunglasses covering his eyes. He started moving toward them, his pace quick and purposeful. Henry turned sharply, grabbing Evan's arm. "Run!" They bolted down the street, Henry's limp slowing him slightly, but he moved with surprising speed. Evan ran as fast as he could, clutching the backpack against his chest as the sound of footsteps pounded behind them. "There!" Henry shouted, pointing toward a narrow alleyway between two buildings. Evan ducked into the alley, his heart pounding wildly as they sprinted through the shadows. Henry followed close behind, his breathing ragged but determined. They emerged onto another street, Henry stumbling slightly as he leaned against a lamppost to steady himself. "Come on," Evan urged, pulling at his arm. "We're almost there." Henry pushed himself forward, gritting his teeth. "Andrew's office is just around the corner." They turned the corner, and Evan's eyes landed on a small brick building with a sign that read, "Andrew Porter, Attorney at Law." Relief flooded through him as they stumbled toward the door. Henry pushed it open, nearly collapsing into the narrow waiting room. A young receptionist looked up in shock as they entered. "Henry?" she gasped, standing quickly. "What happened to you?" "No time," Henry wheezed. "We need to see Andrew. Now." The receptionist hurried through a door leading to the back, and moments later, a tall man with graying hair and a sharp suit appeared. His face was etched with concern as he looked at Henry. "Henry?" the man said, crossing the room quickly. "What's going on?" Henry straightened, his voice calm but firm. "Andrew, we have the evidence. Mason tried to kill me, and now he's sending his men after us." Andrew's gaze shifted to Evan, who still clutched the backpack tightly. "Is it all in there?" Evan nodded silently, his chest heaving. Andrew's expression hardened. "Then we need to get this to the authorities. I'll call my contacts right now." Henry let out a shaky breath, sinking into one of the waiting room chairs. "Thank you, Andrew." Andrew placed a hand on Henry's shoulder. "We'll put an end to this, I promise." Evan leaned back against the wall, his legs still trembling. They had made it. For the first time, it felt like the tide was finally turning. But deep down, he knew Mason Hayes wouldn't give up so easily. The waiting room of Andrew Porter's office felt like a temporary island of safety. The narrow space smelled faintly of old paper and leather chairs, the hum of the fluorescent light overhead providing a low, steady backdrop to their tense breathing. Evan sat on the edge of his chair, his hands still clutched tightly around the straps of his backpack, even though its burden had already been passed to Andrew. Across the room, Henry leaned back against the wall, his eyes closed, the strain of the last few days etched deeply across his face. Andrew Porter sat at his desk in the adjoining office, flipping through the evidence Henry had risked so much to retrieve. From where he sat, Evan could see the lawyer's furrowed brow and the occasional shake of his head as he scanned the documents, bank statements, falsified contracts, and detailed accounts of Mason Hayes's crimes. Andrew finally looked up, adjusting his glasses as he rose from his desk and re-entered the waiting room. His expression was grim, but resolute. "This is airtight," he said, holding up the folder. "It's enough to bring Mason down. I've already made a call to the local authorities. I'm handing this over personally." Henry nodded, though his face betrayed little relief. "How soon will they act?" "Soon," Andrew replied firmly. "With evidence like this, they'll have no choice but to open a full investigation. Mason's name will be in every paper within days." Evan felt a flicker of hope. It was finally happening. Everything Mason had done would come to light. Andrew glanced at Evan, offering a small, reassuring smile. "You did something brave, Evan. Not a lot of kids would have done what you did." Evan shifted uncomfortably, though he couldn't stop the hint of pride that swelled in his chest. "It was the right thing," he said quietly. Andrew nodded. "And that makes all the difference." The momentary peace shattered when the distant rumble of a car engine reached Evan's ears. He stiffened in his chair, his gaze snapping toward the window. Henry must have heard it too, because he opened his eyes and sat up sharply. Andrew noticed their sudden change in demeanor and frowned. "What is it?" Andrew asked. Henry's voice was low and urgent. "They've found us." Evan's pulse began to race as he stood and peered through the slats of the window blinds. A black SUV slowed to a stop on the street outside, its headlights cutting through the dim afternoon light like sharp blades. The driver's side door opened, and a tall man stepped out broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat. It was the same man from Henry's house. Another door opened, and a wiry man joined him, holding something long and heavy in his hand. "Henry," Evan whispered, his voice shaking. "They're here." Andrew's face hardened. "I'll call the police." Henry stood, wincing slightly as he gripped the back of his chair to steady himself. "They won't wait around long enough for the police to arrive." "What do they want?" Andrew asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. "They want the evidence," Henry replied grimly, "and they'll do anything to get it." The heavy thud of footsteps echoed outside. The men were coming. Andrew turned toward Henry. "Get to the back room. There's a fire exit there. Go now." Henry hesitated, glancing at Evan. "Come on, Evan," he said quickly, grabbing his arm. But before they could move, the front door rattled violently, followed by a loud pounding. "Open up!" a voice barked. It was the man in the dark coat, his tone cold, sharp, and impatient. Andrew grabbed the folder from his desk, tucking it into his suit jacket. "I'll stall them," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You two get out of here." Henry's face tightened. "Andrew, no." "I'll be fine," Andrew insisted. But if Mason's men catch you, all of this will have been for nothing." Henry stared at him for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. "Come on, Evan." Evan's legs felt like jelly as Henry pulled him toward the hallway at the back of the office. The pounding on the door grew louder. "We know you're in there, Porter. Open the door, or we'll break it down." "Go," Andrew muttered under his breath as he stepped toward the door. The back hallway was dark and narrow, the fluorescent lights flickering faintly overhead. Henry gripped Evan's arm tightly, guiding him toward the metal fire exit at the end. "Stay close to me," Henry whispered. Evan nodded, though his heart was thundering so loudly in his chest he couldn't think straight. Every sound seemed amplified: the pounding at the front door, the muffled voices, their own footsteps echoing down the hall. They reached the fire exit, and Henry pressed a hand against the bar, pushing it open slowly to keep it from squeaking. Cool air rushed in as the door swung out, and they stepped into a narrow alleyway lined with trash bins and puddles. Evan glanced back over his shoulder, half expecting the men to appear behind them. "Where are we going?" he whispered. Henry motioned toward the alley's end. "We need to get out of here. If we can make it to the main street, we can disappear into the crowd." They hurried down the alley, Henry limping slightly, but moving with surprising speed. Evan kept his head down, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders with every step. The sound of shouting erupted behind them, followed by the sharp crash of something breaking. "They're inside," Evan said breathlessly. "They'll realize we're gone soon," Henry muttered. "We need to keep moving." They emerged onto the main street just as Mason's men appeared at the other end of the alley. "There they are!" one of the men shouted. Henry grabbed Evan's hand. "Run!" They darted into the crowd of pedestrians moving along the sidewalk. The noise of the city, the honking horns, the distant hum of conversation was overwhelming, but it also provided cover. Evan weaved through the people, keeping his head down and holding tightly onto Henry's hand as they pushed forward. "Don't look back," Henry ordered. "Keep moving." Evan wanted to look, to see how close the men were, but he forced himself to focus on the path ahead. The two of them crossed the street, dodging through traffic as horns blared angrily. They turned a corner, ducking into a narrow alley that led behind a row of shops. Henry finally stopped, leaning against the brick wall to catch his breath. Evan's chest heaved as he looked up at Henry. "Do you think we lost them?" Henry nodded, though his face remained tense. "For now. But we can't stay here long." "What about Mr. Porter?" Evan asked, worry creeping into his voice. Henry's gaze softened. Andrew knew what he was doing. "He'll be fine. And as long as he has the evidence, Mason's days are numbered." Evan sank onto the curb, his legs still trembling from the chase. "I don't understand," he said quietly. "Why won't Mason just stop? He knows the truth's going to come out." Henry crouched beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Because people like Mason don't believe the truth can touch them. They think they're untouchable, that they can buy, bully, or bury anything that threatens them. But the truth has a way of catching up, Evan." Evan looked up at Henry, his brow furrowed. "Do you think it's enough? The evidence, I mean?" Henry nodded slowly. "It has to be. And because of you, Evan, we have a chance." Evan managed a small, shaky smile. "I just want it to be over." "It will be," Henry promised softly. "Soon." The two of them sat quietly in the alley, the sound of the city buzzing faintly around them. For the first time, Evan allowed himself to breathe. They had made it this far. Mason's men hadn't caught them, and the evidence was on its way to the authorities. But deep down, Evan knew Mason wouldn't give up without a fight, and the final confrontation was still to come. The city had settled into the quiet rhythm of evening, but for Evan and Henry, there was no peace. They sat in the back corner of a small diner, the kind with chipped linoleum floors and coffee that tasted burned, no matter how fresh it was. The booth they shared creaked whenever either of them moved, and the low hum of the flickering light overhead only added to the unease Evan felt deep in his chest. Henry had ordered them both hot teas, though neither of them drank it. The two of them kept their heads down, pretending to blend in, though they both knew the truth. Mason Hayes's men were likely still searching for them. Evan's mind buzzed with worry. He glanced at Henry, who sat with his hands wrapped around the ceramic mug, his expression distant but calm. It amazed Evan how steady Henry looked, even after everything they had been through. "What happens now?" Evan asked quietly, breaking the silence between them. Henry looked up, his gray eyes meeting Evan's. "Now we wait for Andrew to deliver the evidence to the authorities. If all goes as planned, Mason will be arrested by morning." Evan bit his lip, his gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, the glow of streetlights painted the sidewalk in pale streaks. Cars passed by slowly, their headlights sweeping across the diner's interior. Each one made Evan's chest tighten, but none of them stopped. "What if Mason gets away with it?" Evan asked suddenly, voicing the fear he hadn't been able to shake. Henry's face softened as he set the mug down. "He won't," he said firmly. "Men like Mason only win when the truth stays hidden. But we've pulled it into the light. People will see what he's done now, and he can't hide from it." Evan nodded, though the knot of worry in his stomach didn't loosen. "I just want it to be over," he admitted. Henry reached across the table and placed a steady hand on Evan's shoulder. "You've done more than most would, Evan. You've been braver than anyone could expect. You brought us this far, and that counts for something." Evan managed a small smile, but before he could respond, the faint sound of a car door slamming outside made him freeze. Henry's gaze snapped to the window, his face hardening. He turned to Evan, his voice low and sharp. "Get down!" Evan didn't hesitate. He slid off the booth and ducked under the table just as the diner door opened with a faint chime. From his hiding place, Evan could see two pairs of shoes step onto the checkered floor, one pair polished and sleek, the other rough and scuffed. The shoes stopped near the counter. "Evening," the waitress said cheerfully. "Evening," a deep voice replied. Evan recognized it instantly. It was the tall man in the dark coat. "We're looking for someone. An older gentleman, silver hair, and a boy." Evan's breath caught in his throat. He clutched the straps of his backpack tightly, trying not to make a sound. Henry's calm voice came from above the table. "I don't think you'll find what you're looking for here, gentlemen." Evan's heart skipped a beat. He wanted to shout at Henry to keep quiet, to hide, but he knew it was too late. The tall man stepped closer. "Henry Parker," he said coldly, "I thought you'd be smarter than this. Hiding in a place like this? Not your style." Henry didn't reply. The other man spoke, his voice sharper and more impatient. "Where's the folder, Parker?" Henry's tone remained even, unshaken. "I don't have it." "Don't lie to us," the tall man growled. "We know you took it from the house." Henry let out a faint chuckle. "What's the matter? Nervous your boss will lose everything once the truth comes out?" Evan peeked out from under the table just enough to see the tall man step forward, his hands curling into fists. The waitress, sensing the tension, had disappeared into the kitchen, leaving the diner empty except for them. "You're going to tell us where it is," the man threatened, "or things are going to get ugly." Henry met his gaze steadily. "Go ahead," he said quietly, "but it won't change anything. The evidence is already on its way to the police." The wiry man swore under his breath, pacing angrily behind the counter. "Mason's not going down like this, you hear me?" Henry didn't flinch. "He already has." The tall man grabbed Henry by the collar, yanking him out of the booth and slamming him against the wall. Plates and silverware rattled on the nearby tables as the noise echoed through the diner. Evan's pulse spiked. He couldn't just sit there. Henry needed help. Evan took a shaky breath, his mind racing. Think, think, think. His eyes landed on the waitress's phone, resting near the register. It was a long shot, but it was his only chance. While the men's attention stayed on Henry, Evan crawled out from under the table and darted silently toward the counter. His hands trembled as he grabbed the phone and ducked back behind the counter, out of sight. Quickly, he dialed. 911. What's your emergency? There are men attacking someone, Evan whispered frantically, his voice shaking. At Dottie's Diner on Pine Street. Please hurry. Stay on the line, the operator instructed. Help is on the way. Evan hung up, stuffing the phone into his pocket as he peeked around the counter. The tall man still had Henry pinned against the wall, but Henry's expression remained calm. He was buying time. Evan's hands curled into fists. Henry needed him. He couldn't just sit and wait. You're braver than you think, Henry's voice echoed in his mind. Evan grabbed the salt shaker from the counter, took a deep breath, and stood up. Hey! He shouted. The two men turned sharply, their faces twisting with surprise as they saw Evan standing there. Before they could react, Evan hurled the salt shaker at the tall man, hitting him squarely in the face. The man roared, stumbling back and releasing his grip on Henry. Run, Henry! Evan shouted. Henry didn't need to be told twice. He shoved past the wiry man, grabbing Evan's arm as the two of them bolted for the door. The men shouted angrily behind them, but they didn't follow. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder with each second. They're coming! The wiry man yelled. Henry pushed through the diner door, pulling Evan into the cool evening air. Red and blue lights flashed down the street as police cruisers sped toward them. Henry slowed, his hand still gripping Evan's shoulder tightly. We did it! Evan gasped, his chest heaving. Henry looked at him, a tired smile breaking across his face. You're braver than you think, kid. You just proved that. The cruisers screeched to a stop, officers piling out with their radios crackling. The tall man and his wiry partner tried to slip out through the back, but the police were already swarming the diner, shouting orders as the men were cuffed and hauled toward the waiting cars. Henry sank onto the curb, his shoulders slumping with relief. Evan sat beside him, the tension finally easing out of his chest. Is it really over? Evan asked quietly. Henry nodded, his gaze fixed on the flashing lights. It's over. Mason's men are done, and once the police get the evidence, Mason won't be far behind. Evan looked up at the darkening sky, letting the words sink in. They had done it. Henry was safe, the truth was coming out, and Mason Hayes's empire of lies was finally collapsing. Rebecca arrived a short while later, running toward Evan and pulling him into a tight hug. Are you okay? She asked, her voice choked with worry. I'm fine, Mom, Evan said. Though he didn't resist her embrace, she looked at Henry, who stood slowly with a faint smile. You kept your promise, she said softly. Henry nodded, and so did Evan. Days later, the news was everywhere. Mason Hayes had been arrested on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. His face was plastered across the television, his confident smirk replaced by the hollow stare of a man who knew his world had crumbled. Henry sat on Rebecca's front porch, sipping tea as Evan sat beside him, watching the sun dip below the horizon. You think it's really over? Evan asked. Henry nodded, a faint smile on his lips. It's over. And it's thanks to you. Evan looked at him, his chest swelling with pride. You were right, he said quietly. The truth did catch up to him. Henry clapped a hand on Evan's shoulder, his voice soft. And you made it happen. As the sun disappeared, leaving the sky awash in gold and purple, Evan smiled. For the first time in a long time, the world felt calm. Sometimes, Henry had told him, doing the right thing is the hardest choice, but it was also the one that mattered most. A week had passed since Mason Hayes' arrest, and life had finally started to settle into something that resembled normal. The story had made headlines everywhere. Business mogul exposed in fraud scandal, the papers declared. Mason's empire had crumbled, his allies scattered, and the truth was out for the world to see. On a quiet morning, Evan sat on the porch with Henry, the two of them enjoying the gentle warmth of the sun. Henry looked healthier now, the deep lines on his face softer, his eyes no longer haunted by fear. The danger had passed, and with it came a peace neither of them thought possible. Rebecca stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. "Breakfast is ready," she said, smiling softly at the sight of them sitting together. Evan stood, stretching his arms. "Come on, Henry. Mom makes the best pancakes." Henry chuckled, rising carefully from his chair. "How can I say no to that?" Before heading inside, Henry paused, resting a hand on Evan's shoulder. "You know, Evan, you didn't just save me. You reminded me that there's still good in this world, people willing to do the right thing, no matter how hard it is. That's no small thing." Evan grinned, feeling the weight of those words settle in his chest. "I learned that from my dad," he said quietly. "He always told me to help people, no matter what." Henry smiled, his gaze warm and full of pride. "He'd be proud of you, kid." "I know I am." Evan beamed as they headed into the house, the smell of pancakes and fresh coffee wrapping around them like a promise of brighter days ahead. Sometimes, a single moment of bravery can change everything. A choice to act, even when the world feels heavy, can make all the difference. Evan had learned that firsthand, and though the memory of the river and the danger that followed would stay with him, so would the knowledge that courage and kindness could stand against even the darkest of odds. Henry Parker got his life back, but Evan gained something, too, a belief that doing the right thing matters, no matter how small or scary it might seem. Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story of courage, truth, and hope, don't forget to give the video a like and subscribe to our channel. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Evan's shoes? Stay tuned for more inspiring stories like this one, where ordinary people show extraordinary bravery. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next one. See you soon, and remember, sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change a life.